So, welcome to Module 3. In Module 3, we're going to look at requirements, planning, direction, and review. And we're going to focus more intensely on the business aspects of CTIA. So let's get started with an overview of the module, looking at the objective for this module. So for intelligence-driven security, organizations need to build a threat intelligence program and identify the right team members to implement the program. So like I was talking about many modules ago, it's very important that we have top-down buy-in to the threat intelligence program that you want to create. It's very important that a threat intelligence program be added to the organization if it doesn't already exist. So let's jump into the module. We're going to start with understanding the organization's current threat landscape. So this will bring us into identifying critical threats to the organization, also assessing the organization's current security posture. We'll look at assessing the current team structure and the competencies in that team, and understanding the organization's current security infrastructure and operations. And lastly, in this section, we'll look at assessing risks for identified threats. All right, let's start with identifying critical threats to the organization. What we want to do is prioritize threats to the organization. We want to conduct brainstorming sessions to identify critical threats and adversaries that may target the organization. Now, this bullet point looks like it's a one-up thing where you have a brainstorming session. But this is something that needs to be done on a periodic basis by the cybersecurity team to make sure that you have an ongoing overview of threats to the organization. So for instance, there could be a Monday morning meeting where you can discuss what happened last week and what are some of the things that you're looking into for this week in terms of the threat landscape. What we do is we rate the threats based upon the impact that they could potentially cause. And so these are going to be impacts to different parts of the organization, impacts to your network infrastructure, to your software infrastructure, to the hosts on the system, to your virtualization and cloud infrastructure, your IoT infrastructure, etc. This is going to have to be prioritized because you want to make sure that you're focused in the correct area. So we have a rating system for 1 to 5 in this example, 1 being no impact, all the way through 5 being critical. And then you rate the possibility of a threat, 1 being not likely, to 5 being extremely possible. So for instance, if you had a exposed port 80 on a web server and it's exposed to the internet, or you had an open relay, that would be critical and it's extremely possible. So a 5 and a 5. However, there can be threats that are of little impact and maybe extremely possible. Since it would be such low impact, it does not rate the type of focus that you would do for a high impact, high possibility type of threat. Then next we look at identifying and prioritize assets and data and incidents. So we identify and prioritize our assets. So what organizations do periodically is they will go through the entire organization and track all the assets. And this needs to be done as automated as possible. We don't want to have to hire teams of temps to go through and find the assets. With today's modern RFID infrastructure and asset tracking, it's much easier to identify physical assets. But we also want to identify programmatic assets, logical assets of the organization, and find out how valuable they are to the organization, analyze them for security incidents going back actually a few years. Remember what we're talking about in terms of persistent threats, where somebody might be camping out in the network or on a host for over 200 days. So it's a good idea to go back and check not just what's going on today, but go back into your backups, your logs from as far back as possible. Your organization might also need to change the way they store data to make sure that in the future you have the capability to scan information from further back. I know a lot of organizations that don't have any good historic data. All their data is within 6 months. And so if you want to be able to find the security posture of your organization over time, you're going to need to make sure that you have the ability to go back in time. Next, discuss the prioritized list. So you wanted to look at the assets, discuss them, find out which ones have the highest priority, involve all the business stakeholders, not just the IT department, the IT professionals, and IT security team members, but you need the stakeholders from the departments that own these assets and that have a direct business impact if there was to be any problem with this specific asset. And then we prioritize the operational efforts in accordance with that list. And so we go with the 5 5s, right? The ones that have the critical impact and are extremely possible. So we go for those first and prioritize them. And the least priority are going to be low impact and not likely. So next we want to assess the organization's current security pressure posture. And so what is a pressure posture? What it is it's the various elements, it's the drivers that put pressure on an organization to enhance the existing security program or to develop a new security program. So what is it that's pushing the enhancement of a security program? Is it that over the last few days, weeks, or years, there have been increasing attacks? Is it because there's been increasing attacks reported in news and on sources all over the internet, and we want to make sure that we are prepared? Those can put pressure on the organization to revamp its security posture or to develop a new security program. We want to assess the current security policies, the strategies that we have for our organizational infrastructure. And we want to see, are those policies germane? Are those policies relevant to the current security milieu out there? Is the policy, a specific set of policies, going to actually be effective in our organization? Can it actually help mitigate the types of threats that are out there, loopholes and attacks from the outside? So to assess that security posture, we have to answer the following questions as an organization. How attractive is the organization to adversaries? So, if you are let's say that you work for a paper vendor. All you do is you package paper and sell it on pellets, ship it out. So you don't have anything that affects national security. You don't have a lot of money anywhere. It's a low volume industry. Maybe you don't have a high level of attractiveness for adversaries. I will say this, though, that any organization with a very bad security posture is attractive for attack if they are found. But either that, if you have an organization that's a multi-billion-dollar organization that has millions of customers with all kinds of personal information, then you become a high-value target for threat actors. How much pressure is the organization facing from its customers on their security posture? I remember there was a credit union, and the credit union had a web page, and when you go to the front page, it was HTTP. It wasn't even HTTPS. And so when I examined the page, I found that there is an embedded element, so the actual login element, so wherever you log in, put in your bank information and your password, that was actually being fed into the HTTP page as an HTTPS link. So it was actually an app within the page. It looked like it was all one page, but it would have been so easy for them to actually take the entire page and make it HTTPS. And for years, I tried to get the attention of the organization to tell them to change the way they did things. So every time I logged into the website, what I would do is intentionally put in bad information, and when it failed over, it would take me to an HTTPS page, and then I would put in the correct information, because I didn't want any of the initialization of my contact with that company going out plain text. But they did not have a mechanism for me to complain appropriately. But at least from one customer, there was a little bit of pressure for them to change their security posture. So how much pressure is your organization facing? Do you get complaints in your organization about the possible chinks in the security that you might have? How much pressure is the organization facing from its regulatory and legal requirements? If you're in an organization that deals with credit card data, that deals with medical data, that deals with stock trading and many other areas that have great regulations, then you need to make sure that as those regulations are updated, that your organization stays up to date with the latest changes. What about the various organizational factors that lead to the need for security? And this can be a wide range of factors that are putting pressure on the organization to up its game in terms of security. You know, one of the biggest areas is just the fact that attacks and the amount of money that's being stolen is on the increase nearly exponentially. That should be one of the areas that drive organizations to up their game and make their organization present a better security posture. We want to assess current security team's structure and competencies. Who's on your team? What skills do they bring to the table? Do you have team members that need to be upgraded? Do we need to send them to a class, get more education? Do we need to shuffle people around from one team to another to get the competencies that we need in our team? So we look at the structure, find the threat intelligence capabilities of the team. So there are two areas that we look at. Number one is threat intelligence. The other one is security operations. So for threat intelligence, we ask, is there any procedure to monitor, collect, analyze, report threat intelligence from internet, social media, websites, blogs, deep web, or from anywhere? Do we have a procedure in place for that? Yes, you may have cybersecurity professionals that are monitoring some of these feeds, but does your organization as a whole take this and make it into actionable changes in your security organization to make them safe from whatever new threats you find? Is the sharing of threat intelligence indicators done across all security platforms? Does your dev team know what your web team knows, what your network team knows, what your server team knows, what your cloud team knows? Those threats should be communicated between all of your major teams. Are any relationships established with peers, industry partners, and government? There should be a series of relationships that will allow you to get the latest intel on what's going on. So for instance, you should have team members that routinely go to conferences, that take part in webinars, that know people in different places that they can go to ask about the latest information. Are intelligence collection sources, techniques, and strategies reviewed, assessed, and updated on a regular basis? If you have team members or your organization is comfortable with where they get their security information, then that's probably an issue. We want you to not be comfortable. You need to be searching constantly for new sources, new news, new information, so that you can be on top of any new changes that come out. Is context provided to intelligence information, knowledge on external indicators enhanced by internal threat data? So are we taking what we find on forums and in webinars and where we gather this information? Are we taking what we find and changing the way we do our threat assessment on our systems, on our network, on our hosts, on our routers and switches, whatever it is, so that we have adapted to the new information. So for instance, if we find that there is a new style of APT attack, and this new style of APT attack involves multiple factors, well, that should be immediately integrated into how my systems are assessed. Next, we go to security operations. So we start with threat intelligence. Now we go to security operations under the auspices of the team's structure and competencies. Are there any procedures for assessing and prioritizing threats? So as a threat becomes known, do I have something in place, something written, something that we've practiced that will prioritize the threat? One of the issues with any threat response is the lack of wargaming. This is something just like if you were learning to box or to do MMA or to do karate or something like that, you practice the same moves over and over again so that when it comes time to block a punch or duck or whatever it is, it comes as second nature. So the procedures in your organization should be so well practiced that when a team member faces it in a real world situation, it's second nature what they should be doing. Are there any escalation methods to identify and mitigate potential threats and security vulnerabilities? And so with escalation, a lot of times what will happen is a team member or even the entire team might feel that they are responsible for an area where really that should be escalated to another team or even to a team that's off-site. So for instance, let's say that you're in an organization that comes under a major attack and you have endpoint services from a major provider. Can you take the tens of thousands of dollars that you're paying a month for your endpoint services and get engineers from that major provider into your organization to help deal with that threat? So we escalate it from the security infrastructure in the organization to the security team from our endpoint security provider. That's a possibility. So are there rules defined for that? Are threat detection controls, techniques, and strategies reviewed, assessed, and updated on a regular basis? So not only might you have a Monday morning meeting to discuss the organization threat profile, but you might have a quarterly meeting to review what's happening with the organization as a whole in terms of cybersecurity. You would review your threat controls. How effective have they been? How many threats have been thwarted? How have we adapted to new and changing threats on the horizon? Is the pre-existing security infrastructure, such as SCIM or firewall, used to gather internal intelligence? So we need to make sure that we are always gathering intelligence and turning that into information that can be acted upon by the organization. So that's the security team structure and competencies. Next, in assessing the current security team structure and competencies, we look at incident response. Is there an established procedure for incident management? I've worked in organizations where there wasn't, and when an incident happens, they don't know how to respond. So we want to make sure that we know how to respond to any incident and that, again, we rehearse the response. So point number 2, was there an assessment of the impact or the potential of the security incident that occurred? Was that performed after that incident was escalated from security operations? We need to make sure that we go back and assess the impact. So once an event has occurred, what impact did it have? So that impact could be a loss of data, exposure of data, compromising of the system security infrastructure. There could be many different impacts that we have. So we need to make sure that we go back and do an assessment on that with our incident response. Is there a formal reporting procedure in which disclosure to a specified individual is defined, developed, and followed? So we're just looking for a procedure that tells us who we should disclose this incident to. In other words, we want to get this data up the chain. To whom should it be? Like stakeholders, for instance, or the IT cybersecurity or the IT community. Sometimes the incident eventually needs to be disclosed to the entire company. Next, we look at incident response, whether security incident management controls, techniques, and strategies have been reviewed. Have they been assessed? Are they updated on a regular basis? So just like we're talking about with all of these other areas, we need to make sure that our incident response is included for regular update. And lastly, in incident response, is threat intelligence used to make an effective incident response function? So in other words, we want to take threat intelligence and feed it into our incident response. An improper incident response for a cybersecurity threat can result in an ineffective action taken for that cybersecurity threat. So for instance, there might be a threat and that has led to some type of compromise on a system, and the response lost the data that showed how that threat actually turned into a compromise. Because we lost the data. Maybe they unplugged the system, and so we lost what was in RAM, something to that effect. So we want to make sure we have an appropriate incident response. Next, we look at vulnerability management. In each one of these areas, the first question that we really are likely to want to ask is there a procedure? Is there a policy? If there is no procedure, if there is no policy, then it doesn't exist. We used to always say, if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. So we want to make sure that there is a method that is captured and then put down on paper. It's not going to be on paper, it's going to be in some of your documentation online or however it's saved in your system. We want to make sure that there's actually a policy. So, is there a vulnerability management policy? Number 2, are the efforts made to patch the vulnerabilities documented, traced, analyzed, and communicated? Again, we're looking to make sure that we are retaining the information specifically when we patch. So if I were a manager and I were in a forum and it turned out that there was a specific threat against a piece of software that I have implemented in a high value area, one of the questions I might want to ask is, hey, is that patched on our system? I should be able to get an answer very quickly. Does the organization have well-defined roles and responsibilities to perform penetration tests? So this would be having a blue team or a red team. A lot of organizations, especially smaller ones, will have a purple team, where on a semi-annual drill or however often they do this, maybe quarterly, they would take members and say, okay, you are on the red team this time, and you three are on the blue team, and this is the test that we're going to be doing on the organization. So you want to make sure that you have roles and responsibility for pen tests. Next, we ask, is there a formal process that defines a guideline for starting and managing penetration testing? So how do we start a pen test? How do we manage a pen test? How do we know when a pen test is over? How do we conduct do we do it on live equipment? Do we do it on virtualized networks? Do we do it on substitute equipment? What is it that we use for the pen test? What's our process? That needs to be completely documented. Next, whether vulnerability management controls, techniques, and policies are reviewed, are assessed, and updated on a regular basis. So we want to make sure that we update those policies. And vulnerability management performed on all the areas of security within the organization, from top to bottom, from physical security to network edge security to router and switch security to server security, host security, virtualization infrastructure security, IoT security, all the way through. There are many other layers of security that I could talk about, but we want to make sure that our vulnerability management controls are performed, our vulnerability management tests are performed on all the areas of security in the organization. All right, that moves us into understanding the organization's current security infrastructure and operations. So there are some security controls that we need to look at to understand where our organization currently sits in terms of security posture. And the first one is SCIM. What we want to do is it's going to perform our real-time security operations center, or SOC. You'll see that acronym used most of the time. Identifying, monitoring, recording, auditing, and analyzing security incidents. So our security information management is also going to be tracking suspicious end user behavior. So SCIM is also very important. NGFW, next generation firewall. And this is an area that is rapidly changing. It is my contention that most edge security, network edge security, and host security is going to be fought by AIs, and that your job and my job with security information management is to manage how the AIs are deployed and what specialties that we get for the AIs. And so when you look at an NGFW, next generation firewall, we're starting to get to that level. So with an NGFW, they have the capability of detecting and blocking advanced attacks. They have not just rules and policies, but they have heuristic algorithms and near AI level competencies that allow it to adapt to changing situations right there on the network edge. So it helps in DLP, which is data leakage prevention, user identity related control, because you can manage identity through most next generation firewalls, URL blocking, application control, and a lot of these NGFWs have application reverse proxies. So you can reverse proxy back into your organization and isolate application authentication and security from the internet. They have SSL and SSH inspection and network access control. And network access control allows you to have rings of access. It's a much larger area that we're not going to really talk about at this point. But NGFWs have quite a lot of capabilities these days. If you have an old school firewall, you're still dragging around a PIX or some other type of old school firewall, or the firewall has not been the focus of your organization, consider that an extremely important part of your organization needs to be not just a firewall, but a next generation firewall. Next we go to gateway. A gateway is a node in a network that routes traffic from workstations in the organization to external command and control servers. So it acts as a way to move data from inside the organization to the edge of the organization. And what you can do with a gateway is use it to identify installation of remote access Trojans or rats and malware and other types of malware on a system. And then we have IDS, IPS. Just like NGFWs, IPS and IDSs are going smart. Right? They're going to be run by narrow AIs in the near future, and some of them already are. So they help in increasing the security network monitoring traffic by inspecting packets for suspicious content. So what an IPS does, similar to an NGFW, which will also have stateful inspection capabilities, is they take that frame, right? A frame has a source and destination MAC address. Inside the frame is a packet. So they open up that frame, and inside the frame they find a packet that has a source and destination IP address. And they open up that packet, and inside that packet is a segment, a TCP or UDP segment, that indicate which port that this information is going to be sent to. And inside that segment is your data. They look at the data, look at the way that the segment and the packet are formed, and make sure that there's nothing that looks like it is malware or some type of attack or fits the signature of the beginning of an attack, puts that packet back together, puts it back into a frame, and then forwards it out of the interface. Right? So you actually have to have quite a lot of very good technology to do that for very high throughput networks. But that's what you pay for when you pay a lot of money for a good intrusion prevention system or intrusion detection system. So it identifies the possible violations of security policy, including unauthorized access, as well as misuse. I worked at a private school once, and they did not block any type of internet access, but they had specific laws, rules that dictated what types of sites that faculty and staff could go to and what type they couldn't. And then there was a quarterly, or actually I think it was a monthly report that was put out, and when people broke those rules, they were misusing the system and they were called on the carpet for that purpose. I really think we should have just blocked them from using those sites. But either way, that is unauthorized access, right? Misuse. Next, we look at endpoint solutions. So it protects devices that are connected to the network from outside the firewall or perimeter with the ultimate objective of protecting the organizational network from attacks. Right, so when we look at endpoint solutions, what we have is a server side and a client side. So let's say, for instance, that you are using some type of antivirus vendor, and the antivirus vendor sells an endpoint solution. So what you'll do is you'll install the server side, and you'll have a couple of servers that are dedicated to servicing all the clients, and then there'll be a client on each of the workstations, tablets, phones, etc. that you want to manage. And then you can centrally manage patches, updates to the antiviral, anti-malware, scans, all that kind of stuff from one location. So having a good endpoint solution is a very good security control for your organization. All right, now we look at assessing risks for identified threats. So once you have an identified threat, you have to identify, assess what are the risks associated with those threats. And so you need to consider what business risks that might result from whatever measures that you take. So you would assess this in terms of the activities and the devices and the programmatic structure that your organization currently has. And so you might find that there is a virulent type of malware that's out, but it really doesn't apply to what you have installed anywhere on your organization. Or it could be the other way around. You are in the direct path of whatever this virulent malware is. So what do you do to assess the risk? What we do is we're going to do some mapping activities. Number one, what are the various operational technology IT systems that are vulnerable to the threats? Again, we want to look and see if we are vulnerable or not. Even human factors. It could be that our system isn't vulnerable, but we might have a user that might be suckered into creating another type of vulnerability. What are various security controls that are present to protect the systems? And do these controls cover the known security vulnerabilities? And if it turns out that the security controls that we have don't cover vulnerabilities, then this can trigger a review of our security controls, because we may need to change our infrastructure a little bit to make sure that in the future we'll be able to cover that vulnerability. And then which key operations are vulnerable, and identify any incidents that have already happened and what their impacts have been for operations. And so when we do this, we can identify the goals and requirements for building a good threat intelligence program, and we can also enhance our organization's security posture. So that brings us to understanding requirements analysis. We're going to look at mapping out the ideal target state for your organization. We're going to look at identifying intelligence needs requirements, threat intelligence requirements. We're going to look at threat intelligence categories, business needs and requirements, intelligence consumer needs and requirements, priority intelligence requirements, factors for prioritizing requirements. We're also going to look at the Moscow method for prioritizing requirements, prioritizing organizational assets, the scope of your threat intelligence program, rules of engagement, non-disclosure agreements, and we're going to look at avoiding common threat intelligence pitfalls. So we have a lot to go over in this section. So let's jump on into it, and we're going to start out with mapping the organization's ideal target state. And this is where we use threat intelligence. There are lots of benefits for threat intelligence. What we want to do is consider many of the aspects before planning and implementing a threat intelligence program. We don't want to jump into the creation of a threat intelligence program without really having an understanding of where we want to go. Where is the ideal? Where are we setting the bar? So we need to assess the existing operational capabilities. We want to look at IT assets that are most critical. We talked about an assessment in that area in the last module. We need to identify the valuable internal assets, identify possible threat actors, their TTPs, campaigns that might target our organization. So again, we're going to be making use of all the resources, all of the forums that we're involved with, all of the perhaps meetings that we go to with similar roles in other companies, and maybe even events that give us this type of threat intelligence. So we want to identify those. Also, assess and evaluate the efficiency and effectiveness of existing security system capabilities. You may have an existing infrastructure. One of the areas I find when I go into a customer site is very often there is an existing, underused, and incomprehensible infrastructure. In other words, somewhere a year or two ago, some group installed a very sophisticated security infrastructure that included many different controls, many different automation capabilities, but the team was never trained on how to use it. However, the management team was able to put a check in a box to say that they have implemented this security infrastructure. So what has to happen at that point is we need to assess if what has been installed is actually useful or if it's a boondoggle. In some cases, that installed product or set of products will need to be torn down and rebuilt from scratch. In other cases, we'll be able to use it properly and integrate it into a nice threat assessment and security solution for that organization. Assess the ability of security professionals to monitor, detect, mitigate, prevent, and remediate various targeted attacks. One area that I really have fun with in a customer site is to say, all right, we have this type of attack. What is it that you do, or where is it that you look to find out information about this? And depending on the types of teams, I don't often get cogent answers. For organizations that have a very well-developed cybersecurity team that is very good at threat assessment, I'll get answers immediately. But from teams that have not really put together an adequate organization, they'll flounder. So we need to make sure that everybody who's involved with threat assessment in the area of cybersecurity will be able to detect, mitigate all these things that we listed for any given type of threat. Lastly, to identify operations and teams to support the threat collaboration environment. So we want to make sure we have the appropriate teams. And one of the areas that we want to do at a management level is create the structure. We also want to make sure that we have a good periodic review, that we have annual, semi-annual, and quarterly meetings that are scheduled far in advance, that we have specific sources that we look for, and we also want to make sure that our team members exhibit creativity and as much out-of-the-box thinking as possible to try to anticipate what might be happening in the cybersecurity theater. So what about needs and requirements? The needs and requirements of intelligence are going to guide your organization to define the scope that you're going to need for your threat intelligence program. So we have need for intelligence. We also have intelligence requirements. So let's look at the need for intelligence. We want to identify the needs of the threat intelligence by answering a couple of questions. The first question we want to answer is, what type of intelligence does the consumer need? And what we want to do is avoid TMI, too much information. So if a manager, or maybe even let's take it down a little bit further, and a team member in your cybersecurity threat intelligence assessment team gets a 500-page report with a whole lot of raw data, how useful is that? How will that team member be able to use that report to effectively counter any threats? Well, I think that we would say that that is not the type of intelligence that the consumer of that threat intelligence needs. They need something that is distilled and that is information that can be acted upon in a quick manner. We need to answer another question. That is, when does this threat intelligence need to be delivered to the consumer? And so, does the consumer of this information need it immediately as soon as we get the intelligence? Or is it going to be categorized, allowing us a certain amount of lag time? So let's look at some examples of intelligence needs. Number one, who are the possible adversaries of the organization? Who are the actors? So if you are in an organization, let's say that you work for one of the major credit card processors. Well, we have some pretty good ideas of what type of information people are going to be after. And with that in mind, we can get some pretty good ideas as the threat actors that might be looking for that information. Is the organization equipped to thwart botnet attacks? And the identity need in this case is botnet. And so we want to be able to assess whether the organization can detect botnet activity, botnet apps, and remove them. What vulnerabilities exist in the IT infrastructure of the organization that is exploited frequently? And they use as an example malware, right? I mean, if you think about that type of exploit, we have malware coming in through email all the time. Malware coming in through websites quite a lot. So what is the need for intelligence? What are some of the examples of intelligence needs? What are some of the examples of intelligence needs for your organization? Is your organization perhaps one that might fall prey to spear phishing or other types of attacks? Next, we look at intelligence requirements. In order to contextualize the strategic needs and identify the appropriate requirements, the organization needs to answer some questions. Who, what, when, where, why, how, in terms of threat intelligence. So here are some examples. Why have state-sponsored hackers, hacktivists, or cyber terrorists specifically targeted the organization? And this is actually an important question, because the reason might be because your organization is misunderstood. And so it might be a matter of marketing to cut down cybersecurity attacks. So it could be that some people think your organization does one thing, and maybe there are memes floating around the internet about your organization that say things that your organization is actually not at all responsible for. In that case, a sustained marketing campaign may help to mitigate that level of threat. What are the capabilities of there are a couple of different botnets, the Mirari and the Nakors botnets. What are their capabilities? And how do those capabilities relate to your organization? Is your organization vulnerable to not only those two types of botnets, but others? Next, we ask, how are the vulnerabilities in Internet Explorer, Adobe systems, Java? When you think of Internet Explorer, Adobe, and Java, if you've been in IT or cybersecurity for a long time, there should be lists of problems with each of those that pop into your head, right? And there is the RIG exploit kit. How are they being exploited in your organization? In other words, do you have the appropriate versions of Explorer, Adobe, and Java? In this area, I find that organizations have vulnerabilities because of an improper management of their dev teams, their developers. Here's why. So let's say that there is an app that's written and its security is dependent on Internet Explorer version X. All right, this app is distributed to all of the employees, and you can double click on a link and it takes you into the app. The organization depends on it. But now your Explorer has gone from version X to version Y to version Z, but your company still has to use version X because your developers haven't upgraded the app when Explorer updates. Or there's an app written in Java, and the way the app works, it's using an old version, a vulnerable version of Java, and your developer team hasn't gotten around to updating the app. So if you're going to serve up your own apps in your own organization, you need to make sure your infrastructure, in terms of how your developers interface with that infrastructure, is constantly kept up to date, and that your developers keep up to date with changes in browsers, changes in programmatic environments, etc. Next, we look at defining the threat intelligence requirements. The success of a CTI program depends on collecting and defining appropriate requirements. Again, this stuff has to be documented. So proper requirements help an organization to collect intelligence, reduce the cost of collecting and disseminating intelligence, generate intelligence in the required format, detecting threat actors. So if you have the appropriate structure and it is documented, then the organization finds it much easier to run a CTI organization, a CTI program. We need to start with primary use cause for threat intelligence, like prevention and detection of attacks, forensics, hunting, etc. We want to be able to identify that primary use. Right? We need to be able to decide on how to consume the intelligence that we get. For automated blocking of malicious traffic. So if I'm automatically blocking malicious traffic, I'm going to generate information on that traffic. How am I going to consume that information, that threat intelligence? Right? We're going to need trends, we're going to need reports, we're going to look for anomalies, and all that's going to need to be reported to the appropriate entity in your organization to be able to respond. Also, as a feed to the SCIM solution or other security monitoring solutions. So as I gain threat information, I need to feed it back in to automate my system and make sure that I'm able to act upon that. Also, we want to decide how to consume threat intelligence for threat hunting. So not only do I want to get that information to automate the response to that threat, but I also want to go out and hunt and make sure that I know that none of these threats are currently existing on our systems. We don't have vulnerabilities in terms of these threats. Let's look at the threat intelligence requirement categories. We have production requirements, we have intelligence requirements, and we have collection requirements. Let's start with production requirements. The production requirement should be complete and include information about the short-term requirements that right away head to the top of a priority list. So we call this low-hanging fruit. Right? We want to be able to find requirements for our production environment that need to be looked at immediately. So here's some questions that need to be answered before analyzing your production requirements. What will be the deliverables to the intelligence, your customer/consumer? What's going to be delivered? If we find out what needs to be delivered, then we'll know what that production environment needs to produce, and we can correctly guide that structure. What are the vulnerabilities that are being exploited around the world that the organization cannot identify or protect? And again, this is our reconnaissance. We're looking at the rest of the planet, looking at the threat landscape. We are in forums, we're attending off-site gatherings to make sure that we know exactly what's going on in terms of threats in the environment. And perhaps there's an entire class, category, or type of threat that we really haven't even addressed yet. In that case, we need to work that into the production environment. Next, we look at intelligence requirements. Intelligence requirements generally consist of knowns and unknowns about questions that the intelligence function needs to answer in order to give us knowledge and judgment-based decisions. Remember, we talked about known knowns and unknown knowns and unknown unknowns. We talked about those in the past. And so what we want to do is find out what we have good knowledge of, and then perhaps areas in which we are lacking, so that we can understand how to make decisions. Here's a question that needs to be answered before analyzing intelligence requirements. What must be collected in order to fulfill production intelligence? What type of data? Again, we need to make sure that we collect only the types of data that are relevant. And then we go to the collection requirements. So they need to focus on external and internal sources. In terms of the types of data that we're collecting, there's quite a lot on the external side. We also find that there's quite a lot on the internal side. So the collection requirements that focus on external sources would be, for instance, threat actors, right? While the collection requirements focusing on internal resources would be the attack surface of the organization. So we have multiple threat actors in multiple theaters with multiple tools at their disposal, multiple vulnerabilities that they can take advantage of. And then we have our organization. The attack surface is the sum total of all interfaces, protocols, ports, and programs that our organization is running. That's part of the attack surface. And so we need to know what that surface is, and that will relate directly to the threat actors and what types of attacks they might be planning. So the question that needs to be answered before analyzing our collection requirements is, what data or observation results are required to fulfill our intelligence requirements? So what do we need to collect? And we don't want to over-collect, nor do we want to under-collect data for our collection requirements. Next, we look at production requirements, and we ask, what are the vulnerabilities that are being exploited around the world that the organization cannot identify? We looked at that already. We want to make sure that we have answered that question. For the intelligence requirements, what our vulnerabilities are, what the potential exploits are. For our collection requirements, establishing an association with other organizations. We looked at that already. Map vulnerabilities being exploited with the available source feeds on malicious codes, URLs, exploit kits, etc. So we're going to not only do that, but take all that mapping and map that with the capabilities of our software that's defending our organization. And again, we're going to forums, blogs, social networks, etc. to make sure that we are up to date on all the latest types of threats that are out there and that we can collect the appropriate data. Now we look at business needs and requirements. We're looking at business units, internal stakeholders, and third parties for those business needs. So we want to consider those requirements. We want the organization to focus on the most likely threats that affect the organization and its business practice. Now, we don't want to be blind to some of the less likely threats, but we also want to focus on, again, the low-hanging fruit, the ones that are more likely. So business unit needs. What are the needs and requirements for each business unit? So, for instance, you may have a production business unit that builds widgets, and they have a bunch of small robot arms, and they have a lot of people that manufacture items and put them on a conveyor belt, and you have a lot of low-level control systems, like SCADA systems that will control some of these types of units. And that's a lot different, for instance, than a shared services business unit that's involved with collections and accounting, etc. So two majorly different needs. And so we want to find out what those units need in terms of our security focus. Also, risk management, how threat intelligence helps to improve the risk management process. And so what we do is we take our threat intelligence and we can line that up with the highest risk items in terms of our organization itself, and then see if there are threats to those highest risk items. Legal and compliance. Want to check to make sure that the legal issues, contractual obligations, and compliance are met. So as we put together a team to focus on threat intelligence, we also want to team up with our legal folks to make sure that everything we do covers all of the legal obligations of the organization. So for IT, our information technology, we want to make sure that we leverage our threat intelligence to provide protection to all the critical IT infrastructure, critical IT assets for the organization. And in doing so, we are guarding one of the most important parts of any organization. Next, we look at internal stakeholder needs, and those are starting with business executives. What requirements do we have with our executives, right? So our business executives are not going to get the same level of report as our CISO, for instance. Management, different levels of management. What are the needs of high-level management, middle management? End users, how do we protect the personal information and the data of all of our end users? What about the CIO? So what requirements do we have for the CIO? He or she is directly responsible for providing security to all of the organization's IT assets. So what information do we need for the CIO? What about the CISO? The security analyst, security manager, responsible for ensuring that all the requirements are gathered and met. What needs does the CISO have? Next, we look at third-party needs. What about third-party contractors? In many organizations, third-party contractors play just as big a role as management or other types of high-level employees. And very often they need to be dealt with in such a way that they get the relevant data immediately. Suppliers, how do suppliers need to be interacted with in terms of business requirements? Suppliers are going to keep the flow of the business running, right? We're going to be ordering things from suppliers usually on some type of just-in-time basis, and they're going to need information. So all of this, we need to consider the requirements focusing on threats that affect each of these areas of our organization. And then we have business need requirements for other teams, including IT architects and decision makers, and security operations centers, and incident response teams, and security control administrators, and vulnerability management teams. Each of these types of teams will require a different interface into our security architecture, and the amount of information that they get, and how they consume that information, and how they get reports, and what reports they give back to us, and how they dovetail into our automated responses. Each one of these turned out to be very important. Now let's look at intelligence consumer needs and requirements. We're going to look at strategic users, tactical users, also operational users. So what about strategic users? We're going to zoom out, remind ourselves what the difference between strategic and tactical are, right? Strategic, we're looking at the long term, whereas tactical, we're focused on what's happening right in front of us, for the most part. So for strategic users, they're going to be like high-level executives and management, like CISOs, IT managers, and they're going to consume threat intelligence information to understand the high-level trends in cybersecurity. So they're going to need to know what the business trends are so they can make decisions in order to change the direction of the entire organization. They're going to need to make decisions in terms of budget for all the organizations that are implementing your cybersecurity infrastructure, and any improvements that need to be made or upgrades to processes and staff. So that's at the strategic level. In terms of intelligence needs and requirements, we also have tactical users. And these are the people like you and me very often that are the security operations managers, network operations center staff, administrators, architects, and to a certain level, even developers will fall under this. And so they're going to need very timely, very accurate, relevant intelligence, and they can take that intelligence and use it in most cases immediately to make sure that the system is less vulnerable to attack and that they can thwart attack, or that they can stop or mitigate an ongoing attack. Then we have operational users. These are the IR teams, network defenders, forensic analysis, fraud detection department and staff, that you may be on one of those teams. And what's going to be required there? We're looking for context, right? We have an alert that pops up on a system. We want to know the context of that alert. We want to know if it's part of a big, complex attack, or is it just a glitch? Why? Because we want to be able to take action in the appropriate sphere. So we need intelligence like analysis of malware, breakdown of targeted attacks, reports on the attacks and techniques in TTPs, and maybe even the specific adversary of the attack. And very often, in the identification of the nature and type of the attack, we will get the adversary. What group is it that is conducting this attack? And then from there, we can figure out what they want, and then we can form a defense for that attack. There are priority intelligence requirements that we need to look at. Priority intelligence requirements, or PIRs, are essential so that we can make strategic, operational, tactical changes to the organizational structure. And the purpose of these changes is to reduce risk. And whenever you see the word risk, like I've said a couple times before, take that S and make it into a $sign, because risk is always associated with direct economic impact. And that's what we're going to use priority intelligence to do, reduce that risk. They help organizations to reach their strategic goals by providing dynamic situational awareness about an evolving threat landscape. That word dynamic means that it is changing sometimes moment to moment. So we want to be able to adapt to that rapid change. Priority intelligence requirements will help the organization to answer some of these questions. Let's look at some of the questions here. Number one, what type of data needs to be collected? And we want to make sure we focus that collection on the type of data that's needed. Are there any gaps in the collected data? And what talent and resources are needed to support the intelligence program? And in some cases, you'll find in your organization that you do not have the talent or the resources to properly support an intelligence program. In the meantime, while you don't have those in staff, you need to make use of external resources. So PIRs are in the form of a series of questions that assist your threat intelligence team to focus on what's important to high-level management. Now we look at factors for prioritizing requirements. Prioritizing requirements needs a combination of analytical and social skills to develop those requirements. And we're developing them based on priority, and that's going to need that we need a detailed and focused requirements analysis, and that will help us to divide and categorize the assets according to their importance. Let's look at some of the factors that will influence this prioritization that we're talking about. The benefit. And in fact, if you look down at the bottom of that list, risk, right? So we have risk benefit. And both of these deal with $signs, right? So the benefit is if I have a requirement that I prioritize, it should have, if it's a high priority requirement, it should have a high benefit. What about the penalty? You can have a high benefit but have a high penalty. Penalties can be in many different forms. I might have a benefit that moves me from 95% coverage to 98% coverage, but it also increases the amount I need to spend on an annualized basis by an extra $200,000 or $300,000, right? So I have a penalty even though I have a benefit. So those need to be balanced against each other. And then the cost, right? We're talking about dollar signs all through here. And we want to see how much it costs. What is the risk associated with it? So what are the dependencies? So for instance, you might install some type of programmatic infrastructure, but it requires you to use a specific type of database. For instance, maybe you have to run an Oracle database. And maybe your entire organization is using MySQL or Microsoft SQL Server, and it'll be a significant financial, there we go back to dollar signs, investment to upgrade or change or add Oracle databases. And perhaps you don't have the expertise in Oracle databases to install this infrastructure. Again, dependencies. Time sensitivity. You may have something that needs to be done right now, but you may not have the resources to be able to accomplish it. And then stability. You want to make sure that whatever requirements that you're trying to meet result in a stable system and a stable method. And then we want to make sure that whatever we're doing complies with any of our regulatory or legal requirements that we have in our organization. Now we go to Moscow. Moscow prioritization or analysis is a method to order our priority. It plays a very big role in agile project management. And what Moscow means, it's actually an acronym for the M in Moscow is must have. That's compulsory, right? So if you have legal requirements, then you must have it. If you don't have it, then your organization might not be running anymore. It might be taken down by a federal agency. Then we have should have. It's a high priority. Like for instance, you should have anti-malware, antivirus. It's a very high priority. Could have. I could have a complete endpoint solution. So I could have a complete endpoint solution that is automated and so on, but maybe there are financial exigencies that makes that impossible or at least not convenient right now. And then the W in Moscow is won't have. It can be postponed or can be maybe suggested for the future. So the Moscow method is very important to make sure that we prioritize appropriately and that we especially understand the must and should categories. What about operational assets? Operational assets need to be prioritized so that we can prevent unauthorized access and data exfiltration. So here are some of the key assets that must be prioritized and protected. Number one, personal details. We don't want any information about our customers or our employees to be used in any improper way. So we want to make sure and protect that information. There are many ways to do this so that data is never exposed on a public network, but a lot of organizations still have data on networks and it often gets exposed. Number two, financial information. We don't want to allow any information financial-wise, like the financials of the organization, of employees, of customers, to escape either. Intellectual property. You have patents and trademarks and upcoming projects and so on, and those need to be guarded. Also, we have sensitive business data besides intellectual property, plans for the business, meeting dates, projects, etc. You don't want any of that information to escape. It needs to be protected. And login details and IT system information. We don't want employees to write passwords. We don't want to have lists of employees that get put out in a dumpster for a dumpster diver to find and put together a profile of our organization so they can begin spearfishing our customers, our employees. So make sure that those are protected. So there are 5 areas that very much need to be protected in terms of our operational assets. The scope of the threat intelligence program that you will be putting together needs to be defined. If you have an appropriate definition for the scope of your threat intelligence program, then that's really going to help lead to success. All the stakeholders of the organization should have a common understanding of the goals, responsibilities, scope, and boundaries of the program. So this is going to be the first series of high-level meetings that you have with the management, several layers of management, to make sure that everybody is playing from the same sheet of music. And from there, it's important to start with a well-defined scope, and that'll help us to avoid modifications. Avoid modifications, you know what that means? Scope creep. You know what scope creep is, right? We start off with a project, and then as we start to implement it, more is added. And then we're implementing it, and then more is added. And then eventually, it's such a huge project that nothing can be completed on time, and all the deliverables are missed, and the project goes over budget, and lots of people get in trouble. So we want to avoid modifications. In project management, what I want to do usually is put in penalties, built-in penalties for modification. So for instance, if this specific type of scope creep happens, then that automatically triggers a budgetary upgrade or update. And that would make it so that the organization really doesn't want to increase that scope. So it's very important to get that scope well defined. And so the scope of threat intelligence programs will consist of, number one, the objectives. We talked about that a little bit already. The requirements for our threat intelligence, the criteria for acceptance, limitations of the program. Again, that's to help avoid scope creep. The final threat intelligence deliverables, the constraints to be considered. We always want to limit the size and scope of the program. Organization of intelligence teams, you want to make sure that that is very well set out, planned, and communicated. Who's on what team and what are their deliverables? When are the deliverables due for each team and each team members? We want to identify business risks, and these are risks for not participating and risks that involve the implementation. Like for instance, during the implementation cycle, is it going to cause some downtime or some disruption? Timetable schedule. This is where very good project management software comes into play. And then the estimation of the budget, and this needs to be planned extremely carefully because you don't want to end up with a project that lasts longer and is over budget. This can lead to all kinds of negative effects. When we are engaging our organization to work with cybersecurity projects, we always want to have rules of engagement, or ROE. The rules of engagement is the formal permission to implement that program. The rules of engagement give us top-level guidance at the management level and at the overall level of the type of intelligence program that we're going to be running. And we also have ROE assistance. So we want to help the intelligence team to overcome any legal, federal, and policy-related restrictions to use different tactics, systems, and personnel. What does that mean? Well, what we want to do is indemnify. We want to make our team non-legally culpable for anything that may happen. So for instance, let's run an example. This has happened in many different areas, but this is one that I actually know about. There's a cybersecurity worker who had an ROE, and he was to do a penetration test on a network. He found another IP address that should have been tested, and so he did. He tested that IP address, and it was outside of the ROE. So he was prosecuted and jailed because he went outside of that scope. ROE is very important. It protects the organization, protects the individuals, makes sure that we stay within those rules of engagement, and it protects the individuals and anybody who's participating, because if we're doing something that in other contexts might be illegal, but we say, hey, you have been contracted by our organization to do these specific things, then it is not illegal. It's actually legal. So let's take another type of pen test where an organization or a person is engaged by a company to use Metasploit and other tools to prove that either their systems are vulnerable or not, and to write a report, etc. And they run scans, they run hacks against systems, etc. And in the process of doing that, they disrupt the company, the business. Well, it's all part of the test. It's all part of the ROE, and they won't get in trouble. Whereas if I were to do the same thing to another business that I don't have an ROE with, then I'm going to be in big trouble. So ROEs are very important, rules of engagement. Then we have NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. Have you ever had to sign a non-disclosure agreement? I've had to do that for many different projects where we have information that is company sensitive and company private, or if you're a civilian working in a government or military situation and you don't have a security clearance, they may make you sign an NDA. So many documents and other information regarding the threat intelligence may contain critical information that could damage the organization or even the other party, or maybe both of them. And so we want to make sure that that information is not disclosed. Think of an NDA as legally binding as having a secret or a top secret clearance or a Q clearance. Working for a government organization, there are specific requirements for information dissemination that if you don't meet, you can be federally prosecuted and put in jail. NDAs can be that binding. So it's very important to make sure that your organization makes wise use of them. It's a security contract that's signed between those two people or those two companies for making sure that you maintain that security for that mutually shared information. A signing agreement guarantees that the company's information will be treated confidentially. And it also guarantees that they have the right to take legal and punitive action if that contract is violated. Right? So if there are any negligence, you have liability with this contract. So we want to make sure that we make use of NDAs and that if our organization is involved in an NDA, that we faithfully adhere to the NDA. We also want to avoid some of the common threat intelligence pitfalls. Those include unreliable intelligence sources. So especially when you go into a forum, not everybody who's in the forum knows what they're talking about. In fact, there is probably a high percentage of people that don't know what they're talking about. So make sure that you know what the source is and that it's reliable. So if you're relying on low-cost, free, open source intelligence, you can get unreliable data. Inadequate communication. Intelligence information needs to be communicated to higher management. Again, this is why communication skills are so important for the CTIA. It has to be documented, made universally accessible, maybe through a portal, news feed, news briefs, and we also have to do this regularly. Another pitfall is data without context. So this is intelligence data without scope, and interpretation is useless, right? So if we see, like we have information about a specific type of attack, and that information is presented, but we don't say that this is something that's raging all over the world right now, and in fact, our organization is under attack. We just presented the information. So it needs to be contextualized. Also, lack of standardization, lack of proper standardization of formats, for instance, representing units, etc. There was I believe it was the Mars orbiter, and it overshot Mars and later crashed because one team was using metric and the other was using imperial units. And so they miscommunicated. They weren't standardized. And the same thing can happen, and you can have a project crash because you don't have standardization in your organization. Lastly, we have the lack of technology capabilities. Your intelligence is useless if a proper technology to use and consume the information isn't available. You need to have proper technology to make use of, consume that information. So there might be information, there might be analysis techniques, but they're going to be restricted when it comes to taking that information and using it in an operational context because of the lack of technical capability. And so in this case, the organization may need to upgrade their technical capability. All right, so that brings us to the next section, which is planning a threat intelligence program. We're going to look at preparing, developing a plan, scheduling that threat intelligence program, planning the budget, very important part of taking care of that threat intelligence program, and then developing a communications plan to update the stakeholders on progress with the threat intelligence program. We're going to look at the aggregation of threat intelligence. We're going to select a platform, consult intelligence for different goals, and track metrics to keep stakeholders informed. So let's start with preparing people, processes, and technology. Let's look at people. An organization might appoint an internal threat intelligence team or incorporate certain duties into existing roles. And this is something that needs to be planned out very carefully. Here's why. If you have a team that is dedicated to threat intelligence, then everything that they do, all of their charter, all of their work day to day will be dedicated only to threat intelligence. Whereas if you incorporate threat intelligence into an existing team, you risk diluting both the team's original roles and threat intelligence. So if you're going to do the latter, make sure that you make it very plain, well written, and defined what the roles of the participants are going to be. Next bullet point in people. Cyber threat intelligence teams must fulfill the following responsibilities. Number one, cyber forensics. So if there is some type of breach in your system, on a host, on your network, we want to make sure that we are able to use forensic techniques to lawfully find exactly what happened. Also, malware reverse engineering. So we may even have a role dedicated to that or have a malware engineering lab. Also, managing threat intelligence operations. This means on a day-to-day basis, someone's going to have to be making sure that all of the components of our threat intelligence system are working together. Lastly, collaborating with all information security teams within the organization. This is not a team that can stand on its own. They are not going to be responsible for the IT infrastructure, and they're not going to be responsible for the networking infrastructure. So those teams are going to have to work together. Next, we talk about processes. So with processes, we have information security processes that derive their benefit from threat intelligence. And if you look at IT in general and the dev cycle where we develop software, all of those can derive quite a lot of good intel and use out of threat intelligence. We need to identify those roles, those teams that can get the most out of it. Organizations need to identify a certain set of processes that require input from threat intelligence and further understand how the intelligence must be presented for that purpose. And if there is a process that requires input from threat intelligence, we also want to automate that input as much as possible, either programmatically or in terms of processes that involve people, in terms of reports. Lastly, in processes, we have in-depth analysis required for understanding the needs and requirements of the audience for threat intelligence. So we don't want to just present threat intelligence and throw the information out there and hope somebody needs it. Rather, what we want to do is analyze the organization and make sure that the threat intelligence that we're collecting is useful. So we have people, we have processes. Next, we look at technology for our threat intelligence infrastructure. We need to properly utilize intelligence, and that's going to require the use of producers and consumers of threat intelligence. So we need to make sure that that is adequately managed. So who's producing the threat intelligence? Where are we getting the threat intelligence? How are we putting together and collating the threat intelligence? And then where is that information going? Those are the consumers of threat intelligence. So there are producers and consumers of threat intelligence. These include the raw data producers. These are people who are just dumping out the raw data. The raw data, as we've seen, is potentially useless for many people. We need people to turn that raw data eventually into intelligence. Then we have the threat data consumers. They're taking threat data, this is raw data that has been categorized by threat, and using that data to produce threat intelligence. And so we have threat intelligence consumers, and these are people that take threat intelligence and they're going to take that and use it in various parts of the organization to help with security. Lastly, we have the threat intelligence producers, and these are the ones who are not taking in the threat intelligence that has been produced by the organization, but rather they're producing based upon the information that they have. So those are threat intelligence producers. There's a note at the bottom here that we see that organizations must seek to automate the process of consuming and distributing threat intelligence to the security devices. This is, again, another very important point. Just like I was saying before, all of this needs to be automated to the highest extent possible. Now, as we're putting together a threat intelligence team, we want to develop a collection plan. And so the collection plan will include all the activities that involve the collection of data to meet the defined requirements of threat intelligence. So whatever activity you have, whether it is combing through forums, whether it is getting direct data feeds from security news sources, whether it is third-party information, whatever it is, we need to take all that information and collect it. Second bullet point, the collection of data from different sources consumes large amounts of budget. Why? Because it requires people, and people need to get paid, therefore your budget, right? That effort, that time that is put into collecting the data is going to have to be budgeted because there is a cost. Third bullet point, organizations need to select appropriate data sources based on the requirements of goals of threat intelligence. So what are the goals? What are the requirements for your threat intelligence? As people, we tend to go for things that we've either had experience with in the past or that we like. And if there's a specific threat intelligence source that is formatted nicely and just draws somebody to it, perhaps, but that source doesn't necessarily meet the goals of your organization, then we'll have to move that into, fun reading on the side rather than a source that feeds directly into your threat intelligence apparatus. So identify data sources. So we have 5 high-level categories for data sources for threat intelligence. Number 1 is phishing messages. So we have 5 high-level categories in terms of intelligence data. Number 1 is phishing messages. So a message is sent through email. This information on the phishing message can be a source of the types of attack that your organization is undergoing. Indicators of malware. And in the software solution, the endpoint solution that you implement, there are indicators that can be automated to find malware that's coming through your email. And what your automation can do is to assign a reputation based upon the sender, based upon what the email contains, and several other factors, and eventually mark that email as being probably malware or probably phishing. So there are ways to do that to get those indicators of malware. And we'll talk about some other ways here in the near future. Also, compromised devices. Do we have a device that was actually attacked and compromised? Well, this can give us a very good source of information about the types of data attacks that are happening against our organization. And then we have IP reputation. This is exactly what I was talking about, that takes usually in your email system or even globally, we find organizations that assign groups of IP addresses reputations based upon the types of communications that come from those IP addresses. And then lastly, malicious infrastructure. And we can find that in certain areas, there are infrastructures dedicated to malicious output. And if we can identify those again are data sources for data collection. So not only from forums, not only from news sites, not only from third-party information, but also directly from experience in the organization's computational infrastructure, phishing, malware, devices that have been compromised, IP reputation, and malicious infrastructure. So what we want to do is make sure that as part of our planning for the threat intelligence program, that we schedule it. So we schedule that program. It provides a way to communicate about what activities need to be completed, what resources will be allocated to accomplish the activities, and in what time frame those will need to be completed. Now, what we do in most cases is use some type of software, either project planning or scheduling program that we can use to organize this and make sure that we have scheduling set up appropriately. So let's look at the steps involved with scheduling a threat intelligence program. Number one, review the charter. The charter is a great place to start because it gives us specific information on the purpose of the threat intelligence program, the reason for its establishment, and what we want to accomplish with the threat intelligence program. So we start there with the broad strokes of what we're going to be doing with the program. Number two, build a WBS, a work breakdown structure. This is going to make it clear who is going to do what, when, where, and how. Number three, identify the deliverables. As you go through the development of any program that's a major program, we want to know who's responsible for delivering which part of the implementation of the program. And so if we identify the deliverables, once the deliverable is met, then we can switch to the next deliverable that needs to happen on the timeline. Number four, define all activities. So what is it going to take to set up and schedule the threat intelligence program? What activities are going to be needed from acquisition to installation to education? What is it? We need to define it ahead of time so that we know exactly when they are finished. Number five, identify the sequence of activities. So we take all of the activities, we take the deliverables, we take the work that's being scheduled, and we put it into a timeline, and we can estimate those resources needed for that timeline and put in together a sequence of activities that we can follow over time. Identify and estimate resources for all activities. And resources are not just dollar signs, money, right? Resources are people, resources are things. Like for instance, a resource might actually be a truck. Let's say that your organization has access to a truck, and sometimes that truck is needed to be used to deliver and pick up equipment, and it's a single resource, and so it's scheduled, and so that's a resource that may need to be used. Or you may have a developer that's going to be intermittently involved. That's a resource. So whether it be a thing, a person, or a program, or anything that is limited, that's going to be a resource that you need to make sure you have. Any of you with project management experience can see exactly what this is all about. Number seven, identify task dependencies. In a project plan, what you'll see is one task is going to depend on another. There'll be a link between the two. So in fact, before you can begin the next task, you have to complete the one above it. So for instance, let's say that you have frame the building and you have pour the foundation. Well, what if the people who are ready to frame, they're ready now? And so they just start framing and there's no foundation poured. Oops, hate when that happens. The same thing can happen in setting up any type of program. You need to make sure you know which task depends on others before they are initiated. Number 8, estimate the duration of each activity. And this is something that takes a little bit of experience. When you're putting something like a threat intelligence program together, it's a good idea to consult with experienced project managers because they have a much better idea how much things are going to take. I remember I was managing a project to take a building where we had just moved in and we were improving the interior of the building. I was the facilities manager and the IT manager, and I had several things in that area. And one of the major tasks that I had to complete was to get a brand new sign on that building because there was no sign to indicate who we were. And in my inexperience, I just estimated in fact, I was put on the spot at a company meeting and they said, Kevin, when is that sign going to be ready? And I said, I had no idea actually. I had no idea on earth. So I said, probably about 2 weeks. And the whole audience clapped and everybody was happy. We would have our new sign in 2 weeks. Well, in 2 weeks, I realized that not only did I have to work with zoning, not only did I have to design, manufacture, and get those designs before they manufacture approved by corporate headquarters, who turns out they already had their own designs that needed to be tweaked for our specific building. It goes on and on. And that sign, I think it was about 8 months later that I finally got that sign put up, and I was ribbed over and over again in that entire job whenever asked to do something. Is that going to take 2 weeks, Kevin? Is that 2 weeks? So we always want to make sure that we consult with experienced project managers to be able to identify the time duration for each task and each activity, and don't just throw 2 weeks out there. It doesn't work, believe me. Number 9, develop the final schedule. The final schedule is what the organization agrees on, your project management team agrees on, your team of resources, everything's put together. You stamp that plan and you're ready to go. So you have the final schedule. And when you decide that final schedule, you need to make sure you've reviewed the entire plan. Because another area that I've found in project management that can happen is start date creep, right? We talked about scope creep. The other one is start date creep. And what that is you have resources. We talked about how important those resources are in a project. And the resources have limited windows of availability. And so, for instance, I may have the ability to use a developer during these 3 months. And so my project plan was predicated on the fact that I can use that developer. I may be able to use a resource for picking up and delivering, servers or routers or whatever, but only during a certain amount of time. And so my project plan was predicated on that. However, there could be another team member that really needs to get licensing done and needs to verify parts of the plan legally or with state or local municipalities. And let's say my start date moves a month out. Well, now my developer I only have for 2 months. If the start date moves 2 months out, now I only have my developer for 1 month. So before you put the final stamp on number 9, you need to go back and review all those resources depending on that start date. Plan a budget. And I've worked in many organizations that don't use budgeting, and I've worked in organizations that use budgeting. And I find the smaller organizations are the ones that tend not to use budgeting. So you might say, all right, we need to do the project, and they ask you how much it's going to cost, and if they think it's too much, then they'll do the project. If they think it's too little, then they'll ask you to redo your justification for that amount of money. So ideally, there should be a budget plan for this, because every part of the project plan is predicated on money, and that money needs to be there at the time. Also, start date creep and project creep, where you have the project getting bigger and more tasks added to it, the start date moving further and further out, will also directly affect the budget. Also, a lack of a budget can cause the project to be longer, meaning you need to spend more money, right? So I have the developer for 3 months, it turns out we now no longer have budget for that developer. Well, now I have to engage a less expensive developer, maybe go overseas. That's going to take more time, and it's going to take that specific task and lengthening the project, meaning that we're going to have to pay people longer. You see how it goes. We need to make sure we keep everything as close to the plan as possible, and one of the primary ways of doing that is by having a good budget. Planning that budget is good for two major reasons. Number one, the budget approval drives program funding. And it's also a very good way to show that the organization actually is serious about this project, that they are serious about threat intelligence, serious about cybersecurity. So it shows that they're serious, and it drives the rest of the funding. Secondarily, planning the budget is important as it provides the basis for controlling cost. So without a budget, costs will rise. So there could be an initial estimate, and then, well, we don't have a budget, so, well, if we need to add in another resource, let's just go do that, and we'll just pay for it. And looking back, you may have estimated that you're going to spend X amount, but ended up spending a lot more. So we need to make sure that we have a budget. There are 6 elements that are used in budget preparation. How do you do the budget? Number one, take your activities, we talked about those in the previous slide, and find out how much each activity costs. Number two, have the basis of the estimation. You need to make sure you're basing your estimation on benchmarked information. So in other words, last time the developer was used in a similar project, she charged X number of dollars per hour. And so this time we can look at the same charge for a developer. Look at the scope of the baseline. So we look at the baseline following the critical path of that project. And what is the scope of it? How long does it last? Who is involved with it? And you can get a pretty good idea of budgeting for that. Threat intelligence program schedule. So what is the schedule for your threat intelligence program? When is it going to start? How long is it the initial kickoff going to be, etc.? Next, calendars for resource allocation. This is critical too, that your resources maintain calendars. If the calendars are also automated, that is also helpful. So for instance, let's say that I am a resource for a project, and I have a calendar. Let's say that it is December, and I have time that I'm taking off for the holidays. That's all in the schedule. But let's say that, well, Aunt Mildred, you know Aunt Mildred, right? She flew into town early. And so I tell my boss, hey, you know what? I'm going to take 2 extra days off in December because Aunt Mildred is in town. And so I add that to my schedule. What should happen immediately is that should trigger any other schedules that depend on my schedule to update. If there is no automation for that, then one of the project management staff on the team needs to do that manually and update those resources. So those calendars need to be updated. You know, another resource that you commonly see is something like a conference or a meeting room, parts of a building. Those need to have calendars too. What if one of your budget meetings, you go to the conference room and there are people in there arguing, and there's already a conference going on, and now you have to move to another conference room, or maybe there is no conference room and you have to do it on another day because there was no calendar. So calendars for resources are extremely important, and any good project planning software that you make use of will have resource calendars. Last is contracts, and we'll have various contracts for various parts of this plan for allocating resources for this project. And the size of the contract, the length of the contract are all going to be predicated on budget. Budget's going to determine what kind of contracts that we can have. So all of those are very important elements for budget preparation. Next, we need to develop a communication plan to update progress to stakeholders. And one of the most important parts of a major project plan is to make sure that stakeholders are updated, and updated immediately. If the project is on time, well, then that needs to be reported. And what has been accomplished recently needs to be reported. Is the project or any task running behind time? Well, that needs to be reported. Did a task or a specific item go over budget? That needs to be reported. Did it go under budget? That needs to be reported. The stakeholders really have a strong interest in knowing. What we don't want is to create an unintended firestorm. A firestorm is when perhaps right now your plan is 30% over budget and 40% late on deliverables. And the process of getting there and what's going to be happening in the future has not been communicated to important stakeholders. One of the important stakeholders can go insane with trying to find out what is happening in this project. Why is it over budget? Why is it late? And call you on the carpet and bring people into meetings and have management and people who are working on the project questioned and cause such a firestorm that it actually makes the project slower, longer, more over budget, when if you had just communicated to them, letting them know that yes, we are 30 and 40% over. However, in these areas, in the next quarter and the quarter after that, we are planning to make up for those, and in fact, maybe even come in under budget and ahead of time. If that stakeholder had known that, there would have been no firestorm, and your project plan could have kept going. So very important to have communication. So when we're talking about a threat intelligence program, it's important to keep all the stakeholders informed about the progress of the program. And by the way, this is both during the project plan and project implementation and immediately after, right? So we want to make sure that the program we've started and paid a lot of money for is up and running. Bullet point number 2, communicate with the stakeholders either using software to inform them of the program status or by preparing status reports and holding meetings on a regular basis. Some of the most important stakeholders will not be in your meeting. They're going to be on your scheduled list of communications. And so you would have automated communication to those stakeholders using automated emails, and then you would probably follow those up with summary emails that explain that data. So for instance, if they keep getting email that says that there is a budgetary creep or a timeline creep on your project, you want to follow that up with letting them know that we are removing this part of the timeline, or we are moving budget from here to there, or we anticipate a 50% savings in this area, so that they already know that you've thought through the future of the timeline. Also, create an effective communication plan to help the team know when and how each stakeholder is informed about the process. So you need to make sure that the appropriate people are in the loop. You know, and I've been talking about having a project plan that looks like it's in trouble but isn't. There are also times when you have a project plan that is in trouble, and you need a higher level stakeholder to pay attention so that they can, you know, plant some feet in some behinds to move people around and get the project running. So there are many different reasons for communicating with the stakeholders. So here's some elements that are needed to develop a communication plan. Number 1, the project background. So all of your communications are going to be done with respect to what this project is about. Stakeholder analysis. And if I were you, I would red flag the most important stakeholders, whether they're the ones who attend your project meetings or not, so that they get prioritized communication. There are some times where a stakeholder that you haven't red flagged is actually an extremely important stakeholder. It's important to interview your stakeholders and make sure that they have or haven't recommended other stakeholders that are potentially important to have high priority communications. So ask them. They can tell you. Clearly defined objectives, very important for a communication plan. Communication needs to be not overly verbose, not overly technical, but needs to communicate what is needed at the time. So communication strategy, potential risks involved. And as you go through your project, you're setting up your intelligence, your threat intelligence program, you want to know what risks are involved along the way. And usually with any type of major project, there are going to be risks. We want to know what those are. And then budget allocation for communication. We want to make sure that we have an appropriate budget allocation. In fact, one line item might be the salary of somebody who's responsible for managing communications. Here's an example. On project plans before, when it's crunch time, you have a project, there is a deliverable, there are some organizational people or resources or whatever it is that are extremely problematic, that drive my emotional level really high, and so I shoot off an email to Jane. I cannot believe what is happening here with this project and these people, and when I hit send, it doesn't go to Jane, it goes to Sally. And Sally says, no, you're not going to send that email to Jane. And either sends it back to me and says, edit this, or edits the email for me, taking out the emotional content and forward it. I've seen that happen to great effect in many projects, to have a centralized person to manage communication. I've also seen it work to horrible effect in many projects where that emotional email makes it through my own or somebody else's mental filter and wreaks havoc where it lands. So very important to take care of budget for communications, whether it's communication systems or people involved in communications. Next, we go to aggregate threat intelligence. So once threat intelligence sources have been identified and data has been collected from various sources, the first and foremost step is to decide whether to store the aggregate threat intelligence. So as we are planning our project for threat intelligence, we need to know what we're going to do with the data that we are going to be collecting. So it needs to be stored in a place that can be easily integrated with existing security controls and able to be secured reliably. So we don't want, especially threat intelligence that's based upon information that we've gathered on our own systems, we don't want that leaking out anywhere. We don't want it to go into any hacker community or make it onto anybody's flash drive or anything like that. So it needs to be secured. 3 areas that we need to look at for aggregating the threat intelligence is platform, the next one is portal, and the third one is integration. So we need to decide in terms of platform whether that acquired intelligence needs to be a standalone platform or the organization can use other endpoint detection solutions. So where are we going to put this data? Is it going to be standalone or integrated? And I'm one who always likes to control data as much as possible, so I tend to go with the standalone platform. But either way, your organization needs to have that in mind. The second one is portal. An organization needs to decide whether to rely on a provider's portal or not. Portals offered by the threat intelligence providers enable the organization to send alerts and manipulate data. So let's say that you go with a big name provider. That big name provider says, you know what? We are aggregating your data. We're aggregating data from other sources. And together we're able to respond better to threats that are out there. And they will promise to keep your data safe, but maybe you might want to consider using a portal. We also have integration to consider. Organizations need to decide how to integrate the aggregated data into existing security systems. And again, we bring up the entire idea of automation. And how is it that we take data, aggregated data, and turn it into automation? That's an entire area that needs to be discussed in your organization and in the idea of integrating that data. Next, we look at selecting a threat intelligence platform. You need to choose the right threat intelligence platform for your organization. Why? Well, we have to assess intelligence, right? Leverage that intelligence information. We have to monitor and enforce points. We have to manage intelligent feeds, select appropriate security for our digital assets, and it goes on and on. So we want to have a platform that does all of what we're looking for. So what are the goals that we have for the threat intelligence program? Well, those goals need to work perfectly with the threat intelligence platform. And we're going to look at some factors to be considered when selecting that threat intelligence platform. But let's start with factor 0. Factor 0 is you, or me, or my employees, or your employees. It's the people who are going to be managing that threat intelligence platform. Is there education for that threat intelligence platform? Is education for the threat intelligence platform administrators included in the budget? And not just initially, but over time. We don't want to find a threat intelligence platform that is perfect for our goals and goes way beyond that, but then find we have nobody who can effectively use it. So we see that the human factor, educating the administrators, is 0. Well, number 1 now would be open. We want to make sure that there is compatibility for all of our data feeds for that threat intelligence platform. Right? So also, as you look into the future, as future data feeds, if you've anticipated any of them, you want to make sure that your threat intelligence platform will work with those too. Scalable. We want to make sure the threat intelligence platform is scalable because it's only going to get bigger and worse over time in terms of threats. So we want it to be able to scale out, and there's a difference between scaling out and scaling up. In general, we don't scale up. So scale up would be to add processor power or to add memory or storage to an individual unit. Normally we scale out by adding multiple units, whether these are logical units on a virtual, on some type of hypervisor, or whether they're physical units that are actually plugged into your network infrastructure. So what type of scalability does your TI platform have? Search. Make sure your TI platform provides easy and efficient searching for all your data sources. The most automation wins in this case. Scoring. Ensure that your TI platform provides flexible scoring for ranking threat actors, attacks, and digital assets. And we want it to have some intelligence in scoring, not just flexibility. Workflow. Make sure that the platform supports threat hunting and detection processes as part of its workflow. So those are some of the factors we need to consider when looking at selecting a threat intelligence platform. Now that brings us to consuming intelligence for different goals. All right, so what we look at first is brand protection. So threat intelligence can be utilized to identify unauthorized brand usage, such as phishing sites, identify negative comments on various social sites, etc. So you have an organization. That organization is a brand. So let's say that your company is called ABC Corp. All right? And if your company is called ABC Corp, I'm not talking about your company. It's just the example I use all the time. So let's say that your company is called ABC Corp. And you have brand protection. It's noticed that in several forums, there are hundreds of extremely negative comments about ABC Corp. And that those hundreds of extremely negative comments are from one person. This happens quite a lot. Right? They are spamming all the forums, spamming all the rating systems because they had a problem with your organization. And so if you have brand protection, also it's called reputation protection. They will be able to pull up your automated systems, will be able to notice some of that activity to help you protect your brand. So that's an extremely important goal. And get some of that stuff expunged, erased, so that your organization Still looks awesome. Next, we go to identification of attacker networks. Who are the people doing this stuff, right? Organizations, they incorporate the threat intelligence into the current security monitoring controls, identify adversaries. When we look at not just the adversary themselves, but their entire command control network, right? That is perhaps what has been compromising our systems or trying to compromise your system. So we want to find out the networks, right? Is this attack coming from a specific hacker syndicate in upstate New York? Or is it coming from some people in India? Where is it coming from? So we want to look at those networks. Next, identify third-party risks. So threat intelligence helps organizations to establish additional security controls on data exchanges with business partners. Is your business partner leaking your data? Or is too much data being leaked from your organization to business partners? We want to make sure and know what those risks are so that we can mitigate them. So key metrics to keep stakeholders informed, one of the things that we've been talking about, I've been both looking at the specific plan for our threat intelligence program and in general how we have project plans for major projects. And either way, we want to make sure we keep stakeholders informed. So organizations will need to define metrics for evaluating the threat intelligence throughout the process of the project. So we want to know exactly what's going on while the project itself is being put together. We want to incorporate metrics that assess the current status of the overall threat intelligence program. Where are we with that program? Are there areas that need to be improved through training or enhancing prevention detection capabilities? Even once we have our threat intelligence program up and running, we want to make sure that we are constantly going back and reviewing it. Important metrics that need to be considered in terms of stakeholder information. Number one, time taken to detect incidents. So you have a TI system, it's up and running, an incident occurs, we detected it. Another incident occurs, we detected it. So what if your incident detection time is in the seconds to minutes? That would be awesome, right? But if your incident time is within weeks to months, then we're having a big issue. And what we want to do is take that incident detection time, and it should go down over time. Or if it's a new program, maybe start low and stay low. Number two is the encounter rate. How often are you encountering security incidents? Is it happening once per hour, once per second, once per day? What is the rate that you are receiving these types of encounters? Number three, false positive. Are you getting false positives or false negatives? We need to know what the rate that is and what the reason behind the false positives are. Threat classification. So when we're talking about time to detect, encounter rate, and false positive rate, what classification of threats do those apply to? So for instance, you may have a false positive rate that's pretty high on one type of threat, but a false positive rate that's pretty low on another type of threat. You may have an encounter rate that's really, really high for one class of threats and a low encounter rate for another class of threats. So threat classification. Number five, threat escalation rate. So how often does this threat turn into something else and get escalated? We need to know that information. Number six, internal and external incident rate. How often are these incidents coming from the outside of the network or are they making it to the inside of the network? Internal and external incidents. Number seven, success rate for threat intelligence. We want to have a very high success rate. Be in the high 90s, 99.9 something. So we want to make sure that we have a high success rate and we want to know what that is and we want to communicate that success rate to stakeholders. And then feedback and remarks. We want to be able to send feedback into our threat intelligence system and have remarks based upon specific types of encounters so that we can go back and refer to it in that database if we have similar incidences. All right, we're going to talk about establishing management support. This is, like we've been saying overall, another important part of this, preparing that project charter, establishing case management for our TI program, applying a strategic lens to our TI program. So let's start with preparing a project charter and policy to formalize the initiative. So the charter, it's a document, a short document that gives you an overview of the entire project, the objectives, the goals, an overview of how it's going to be carried out, an overview of who the stakeholders of the project are, the scope of the project in overview. So this is like an overview, an executive summary of the project. And what it does, it ensures that the project is implemented in the right direction and allows you to be able to create deliverables that help to achieve the goals of the project. And here are some elements of the project charter. Number one is project outline. So we go through an outline of the project, some of the assumptions, maybe assumptions in terms of resources, assumptions in terms of access, etc. Identified risks. So we go through some of the risks that we've already identified. And remember that the charter will eventually be expanded into the project plan. So some of these bullet points that we're talking about will actually become fleshed out quite a lot more as we move through the project. Project goals and objectives, the benefits of the project. Remember, all along the way, we're selling this project. We're selling this project to the stakeholders and to the participants. And we have the scope and description of the project and roles and responsibilities of the team involved in the project. So we'll name the team members, what they're going to be doing, whether they're going to be doing project management, whether they are involved in the day-to-day operations of the TI apparatus, what are they doing? And who are the stakeholders? And what are the project requirements? Like, for instance, you may assume that there is an existing infrastructure. Assume you have access to specific organizational resources. So all of these are project requirements. Project milestones. And once we get to a milestone, this is when we've completed a major part of the project that will allow another part of the project to begin. And those are going to need to be reflected in the charter. Also, we have the business case for the project. The business case, and the word case, C-A-S-E, put that S as a dollar sign because the business case usually involves dollar signs. So why are we going to do this? Well, it's going to cost us $17.825 million to do this project, but over 10 years, we will have earned $20 million extra dollars. Or it's going to cost us $2 million to do this project, and over 10 years, we will have avoided perhaps $100 million in damages from security breaches. There are many different reasons that the project needs to be justified, but at some point, you need to make a business case for the project. And by the way, one more thing for the business case. Also, the fiduciary responsibility of your organization to safeguard its data and the integrity of communications might be a big reason to do this project. So business case. Next, we look at financial commitments. So this project is going to engender a whole string of financial commitments. What are those? Those need to be listed in the charter. We have project deliverables. And what is our communication plan? How are we going to communicate this to all the stakeholders and to every other entity that requires communication? Next, this takes us to establishing your case to management for a threat intelligence program. And so if your organization currently does not have a threat intelligence program, how are you going to let management know what are the drivers and the level of importance of having a threat intelligence program? So it's crucial to convince them because they're the ones who control the budget and they're the ones who make policy for the organization. So let's look at 3 areas that are important for making that case. Number 1 is drivers. Drivers are what are the difficulties, the setbacks that are being faced due to the lack of appropriate threat intelligence capability. Your organization may currently be struggling in the area of threat intelligence. And that struggle may not actually be something that management is privy to. For instance, it could be that another organization has consistently worked to stamp out breaches and to make sure that the organization is running correctly and that no infections get out into any of your production areas and working day and night to make this happen. But perhaps they have only been lucky along this path to have avoided serious compromise. And it's time perhaps to formalize that and make it so that it's not luck, but planning, and that will help this organization to avoid trouble. So there are highly vulnerable areas in your organization that are vulnerable to risk. That's a driver for your organization, right? We have areas, we have assets that are vulnerable to risk. The next one is expensive maintenance of damaged and missing assets. So if there is a damaged asset and it's not available, whether it be a server, a service, a router that has to be taken out of service, perhaps you've had to purchase new equipment, new storage, perhaps you've had to work with your cloud provider to restore whole swaths of data. Whatever it is, we have expensive maintenance when we don't have a good threat intelligence program. Unavailability of resources. And whenever you have resources that are unavailable because of threats against your organization, attacks against your organization, then that means that you're wasting valuable time, which is money. And perhaps those resources are unavailable because they've been compromised. Again, a completely different issue, but extremely important. That's a strong driver for establishing your threat intelligence program. Wastage of time and effort in patching inevitable security issues during a disaster. So what can happen is your organization can end up spinning its wheels. Why? Because the organization is not prepared for certain types of incursions. And even a medium incursion into your organization by a threat actor could cause a major disaster. Legal consequences for not complying with regulations. You could have a whole horde of people in suits coming to sue your organization, audit your organization, perhaps decertify your organization, which will lead directly to loss of business, revenue, downsizing, jobs, everything. So we want to make sure that we're in legal compliance and loss of reputation with existing and future customers. And so what will happen is if you have a loss of reputation, because in news articles and in journal articles and online and forums, your organization has been listed as one of the least well-run organizations in terms of security, you're going to lose business, lose customers. So we have drivers. There are drivers that are responsible for making us, as an organization, want to have a threat intelligence program. And next we have our obstacles. Those are challenges and causes that have caused the project not to be started yet. So why is it that you haven't done this in the past? Why now? Well, number one, time consumption for the project is too high. I've worked in organizations where the IT department was understaffed. If you're working 60 hours a week and every employee in your organization is working 60 hours a week, and then a project is given to the IT staff, and the project is demanded to be completed, and perhaps haphazard effort is given to this project, but the exigencies of day-to-day operations pull the IT staff back into operations, right? Time consumption. Next point is insufficient budget for new projects. And so if there's no budget, you can't start the project. You really can't deal with any major project without a budget. Next is risk of disturbance in business operations. If there's going to be the integration of new infrastructure that supports your threat intelligence program that is going to affect your existing infrastructure and perhaps cause downtime, then that can be an obstacle, definitely. I've worked in medium to small organizations where there wasn't budget to have redundant structures. We've never had a crash before. Why would I ever want to have a cluster? That takes so much more money to put together a 3-node cluster than it does just to buy a server. Just put RAID 5 on it. It should be fine. And so when there is downtime, then everybody gets in trouble. But often what happens is there's no budget to support that type of redundancy. If there isn't adequate redundancy in your system, then integrating new systems into your existing system can be very difficult. So compliance may constrain productivity. So you may have an organization that has very severe compliance regulatory needs, and the system that you want to integrate or add falls outside of that compliance. Maybe it might disturb that compliance, is perhaps what the management of that section of the organization might think. And so you'll need to design your TI system to also be compliant with the current compliance and regulations of your current existing infrastructure. No clear ROI. Right? So you're in a meeting. The manager says, look, I've looked at your proposal and I see how much this costs, and I can't see how this is going to make me any money. We're just barely making it as it is, and you want me to spend this much money where we've never really had any kind of severe security breach in the past. And so they can see no clear ROI. In many cases, the ROI is that in 5 years, 7 years from now, when there is an attempt at a major breach that is going to cost your organization all of its livelihood and bring down the company, that's scenario A. Scenario B, with the system you have in place, the breach was stopped before it affected the organization or the organization's reputation. There's your return on investment. It's all in the future. And the last bullet point we have here is the assurance about technical defenses to prevent harmful incidents. And so we may not have a good level of assurance that the technical infrastructure that's proposed would even help prevent incidents. So it's very important that whatever TI infrastructure, whatever TI plans that your project puts together needs to make sure that it overcomes that obstacle and all the others on this list. So we have obstacles, we have drivers, but we also have benefits. So we need to demonstrate that the benefits of having a TI program outweigh the obstacles. So what are the benefits of a threat intelligence program? Number one, decreasing repeated recurring incidents. So one of the areas that I find for organizations that don't currently have a good TI program is that a lot of these incidents aren't even reported. So for instance, there might be a compromised box on the system. This compromised box on the system is sending out torrents of email, and so your email domain is shut down, and the IT staff goes through and cleans the system and reestablishes the email domain, and everything is fine, and maybe the IT manager knows about that, but the rest of management didn't know about that. Or perhaps there was a virulent stream of emails that came through with links that led to malware, and malware attacked several systems, one of them being a production server, but it was able to be removed from the production server between the time of the infestation and before it actually took over the system, and so you barely escaped. And perhaps the IT manager knows about it, maybe even not. Perhaps that wasn't reported to other managers, so they don't know that there is a fight going on. And another part of that fight going on is how much time are employees spending fighting this. So let's say that 5 times over the last year, IT staff has spent upwards of a total of, let's say, 60 or 70 hours working on weekends for threat intelligence needs, like for instance, to stop an infection or to install software or tweak software to help prevent infections or anything that's under the bailiwick of threat intelligence. You've had hours spent on it. So you're already spending money on threat intelligence, perhaps. Either way, you have increasing or decreasing recurring incidents. And if you can decrease those incidents, you spend less money because you're not going to pay people to ameliorate those circumstances. And so you're going to save money. Number two, decreasing reputation damage. And reputation damage can be a constant fight. And if your organization has suffered in the reputation area, then this might be very helpful. And reputation is an area that every organization needs to pay attention to. This is something that needs to be researched periodically. Find out all the areas online where your organization has 1 star or 2 stars and find out what's going on. Find out what forums in which your organization is bad talked by people all the time, or where there are hackers that are gathering together to hack your organization. There are so many different areas that reputation can be improved. So decreasing reputation damage. The next one is improved security of assets. And so we take all the assets of the organization and we increase the security. That's a great benefit. A better productivity. If your IT staff is not spending all their time spinning their wheels fighting for areas and for ideas that are actually part of a TI program, then you're more productive. Increased awareness about the related incidents. So you can take the incidences that are occurring, find out they're related, and perhaps stop any type of action from occurring sooner. Improve readiness against threats, enhance user satisfaction. I've worked in organizations where the users are always talking about some software or issue or another on the system. And if you have users that, when they come to work, they're not going to get spam. When they come to work, they're not going to have another email that says, we've been breached and don't tell the press or whatever it is. The users are going to be more satisfied to work at the organization. And your customers will end up being more satisfied also. So let's talk about applying a strategic lens to the threat intelligence program. So this helps us to understand the present state of security in the organization and align the strategic needs of the organization with that of management. So what we want to do is have a look at the organization overall, where it's supposed to be, and make sure that we're on that path. Strategies. Number one, build the communications bridge between intelligence team and management. So in the project, like we were talking about before, communicating with stakeholders, moving from project to implementation, we still have the same level of communication that needs to occur to different stakeholders, perhaps. Management needs to know when we have certain actionable threats, when we have threat actors that are taking action against our organization. Number two, train the stakeholders about what threat intelligence is and how to leverage it. So how can they use this threat intelligence to perhaps increase reputation? And perhaps they don't know about this. It's very unlikely that every level of manager knows what to do with this. Perhaps we can take a reputation issue and forward that information to our marketing team and have them work on the reputation side of things, just as a for instance. Number three, communicate the implications, importance, and advantages of the threat intelligence program. So implications. So what is this going to mean? How would we look in the future compared to how we look now? What are the implications of having that program now? What does that mean we're going to be able to do? And why is that important to the organization? What advantage does this give us? And you know, one thing that's important to elucidate also is what advantage does this give us above other organizations of the same class? Number four, represent the opportunity. as a favorable outcome for the organization. So we want to say, hey, this opportunity is going to put us in a position to be a different and better organization. And this is why and how. And this is where the money savings comes in. This is where we increase the revenue of the organization. Number 5, use case studies, numerical statistics. And you can also use some of the examples that you have done in your research. Demonstrate the increased frequencies of attacks. What's going on in the world? And threat actors. And this is something that changes fairly radically year to year. And so when you look at your case studies or your statistics, it's also good to get a snapshot of what happened over the past couple of years and then project what's going to be happening in the next couple of years so that your organization has an idea of what's going on. So that's strategy. We have 5 different strategies that we can use to apply that strategic lens to the threat intelligence program. This next section is building a threat intelligence team. And one of the most important parts of putting together any venture is getting the right people together and making things happen with that team. We're going to look at satisfying the organizational gaps with the appropriate threat intelligence team. We're going to look at understanding different threat intelligence roles and responsibilities, identifying the core competencies and skills, also defining talent acquisition strategies for finding those team members, the talent, building and positioning an intelligence team, and how to prepare an effective threat intelligence team. So let's look at satisfying organizational gaps with the appropriate threat intelligence team. So, depending on the maturity of your organization, you're going to need to look at getting together an appropriately staffed threat intelligence team. This can be a very good way to satisfy some of the gaps you may have in that organization. It's not essential to employ individuals outside of the organization. So you're not necessarily going to have to go get contractors, but you can use and create opportunities within the organization to find skilled employees who are dedicated to your organization. Also, you may be able to take internal employees and train them up to be where they need to be to fill those roles. So the 5 essential tasks performed by the threat intelligence team. Let's look at what the team does. Number 1, the threat intelligence team will find threats and translate them into actionable threat intelligence within the environment. So 2 aspects: find and make it actionable. Number 2, they'll do regular research on threat intelligence from different news sources. So they're going to be constantly looking for threat intelligence using multiple sources. We looked at some of the news sources that are available out there, and there are quite a lot more out there than what I've showed you in the past. Number 3, they're going to combine internal and external threat intelligence into tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs, to provide context to the threat data. So after gathering that threat data, that threat intelligence, not only is it going to be actionable, but we'll also find a context for it. What part of the network, which devices, which hosts, which protocols, which part of the organization, which business unit might this apply to? So contextualizing the threat. Number 4, active involvement in intelligence sharing groups. So the employee who's involved with threat intelligence is going to be involved with multiple groups, both locally and nationally and internationally, to make sure that they are on top of the latest threat intelligence that is available. Number 5, threat analysis and incident response support. So this employee needs to have the ability to analyze the threat data, the threat information that they receive, and then help with the response to that threat. And they may not be the ones actually running the threat response, but they would at least be the one to whom the threat response team consulted regarding that threat. They may also be the threat response team. So it really depends on the team member. All right, so next we look at understanding different threat intelligence roles and responsibilities. And there are several of these roles to look at, about 7 of them that we'll look at. The one that you'll probably be the most familiar with is the first one, which is an intelligence analyst. They're going to analyze, contextualize, fuse information that's gathered. They're going to generalize this information, and not only generalize it, but make it so that we can apply it to specific areas. They're going to generate actionable intelligent reports and briefings. And so this person needs to be able to write in a way that can be understood by everybody who they are addressing. Develop a broad view of the organization's threat landscape by regular monitoring of IOCs and TTPs. Again, keeping the ear to the ground, knowing what's going on in that industry. Next, they want to support organizational strategic decision-making processes. So as your organization moves into different areas and different directions, the intelligence analyst is going to support those moves. Lastly, to research and develop imminent threat reports to inform higher level executives about the threat landscape. So again, we're going to be needing somebody with great communication skills that can take the disparate information that's collected and put it into cogent reports for management. The next role that we have for threat intelligence would be malware analyst. And the malware analyst would analyze malware samples from cyber incident response projects and honeypots and wherever they're getting these. And all these can be coming from forums and other locations also. And also perform malware sandbox operations to correlate the acquired threat intelligence with the present attack indicators to detect those related threats. One of the things that we see as a specific skill for the malware analyst is they're going to need to already have a lot of specific experience with analyzing malware, a lot of good programmatic experience in multiple programming languages, a lot of good scripting experience. And on the mathematical side, analysis sometimes requires programmatic mathematical skills for analyzing malware. But anyway, based upon the threats, they're going to need to enhance the detection methods and provide previously unknown related indicators. So the malware that is being analyzed may not have an analog anywhere, and they may in fact be analyzing a novel piece of malware, and so they'll need to be able to categorize it and provide all the unknown information, at least previously unknown, and create indicators for that malware. All right, the next role and responsibility we look at is the incident reporter. So they participate in investigation and analysis of escalated incidents and collaborate with other business units to develop remediation solutions. So they're going to be tightly involved with remediation, right? We have an incident, we have a response. The response includes remediation. We're going to put that part of the organization back into functionality after the remediation of that incident. Validate and prioritize incidents based upon level of risk. So yes, it might be easier and take less time to remediate incidents A and B, but maybe incident C is the one with the higher priority. It may take the most work, but it has a higher risk. So we want to make sure and work on that one. Correlate incidents to specific threat actors and campaigns. So we say we have an incident here. This relates to a threat actor that we've been studying already that has been participating in a specific campaign. So we can link those together. That's what the incident responder does. And the incident responder also will leverage the threat intelligence to find details of sophisticated attacks and TTPs of threat actors. So we're going to go find exactly what tools and techniques, what processes they're using, what did the threat actor use, what did they do to launch this specific attack that created this incident. Next we have the e-discovery and forensics examiner, and they're going to perform e-discovery, and which is going to mean that they're going to search, find, retrieve data for evidence. And one of the areas that we need to be aware of with forensics is that we need to preserve the evidence in a way that makes that evidence presentable in a jurisprudence sense. So in terms of having it available for a court of law, we want to make sure that the evidence isn't contaminated, that it's isolated in a way that will be acceptable to court. And if that evidence has to be handed off to another jurisdiction, that handoff is done in a legal way, again, that preserves the evidence. And they'll also perform e-discovery on corporate network systems and other devices as dictated by a court order. So if there's a court order that says, hey, you need to go and provide this information to the court, the e-discovery and forensics examiner role is going to be the one that takes care of that. And search data, text files, databases, spreadsheets, software, applications, and databases of various types to find the type of information that is required on a forensics basis. So that's the e-discovery and forensics examiner. Next, we look at the security operator. The security operator will manually coordinate and correlate logs and events for investigators and other activities. So they're going to take the logs that are produced by various operating systems and applications and correlate those, coordinate them, make sure that they are available for other roles. Next, the security operator will monitor security perimeters, monitor antivirus, anti-malware software, monitor SCIM events, and other related events to make sure they have their hands on the appropriate data that they'll need. The security operator will also escalate security incidents to threat intelligence, incident response, vulnerability management, and other teams. So the security operator will evaluate the information that they have and determine if it needs to be escalated and to whom it needs to be escalated. All right, so that's the security operator. Now we look at the vulnerability management analyst. And this person is going to manage the technology patching process to make sure that not only our operating systems and on phones and tablets and servers and workstations that they're patched, but also to make sure that we have patching on other devices like firmware on devices that don't have a installable operating system. They have built-in operating systems. So what about firmware updates, etc.? So that's what we're going to do, patching process. Next, we look at identifying the vulnerabilities present in endpoints and servers, in devices, in the organization network. So what are the vulnerabilities? And I tell you what, these are going to be a wide variety of vulnerabilities. So the vulnerability management analyst will have to work with other team members and with information that she's able to gather herself and then find out if it applies to specific devices. So for instance, if you have an infrastructure that uses a specific brand like Fortinet or Cisco or whatever, what are some of the threats that are out there? If you have servers running Server 2019 or Windows 10, or you have workstations running iOS or some other type of operating system, what are the threats against those? What are the vulnerabilities on those operating systems? And then prioritize the detected vulnerabilities and develop mitigation plans. And then they'll be able to present those plans. So if it's an operating system, for instance, a workstation like Windows 10, how can we mitigate that specific vulnerability? Discover new vulnerabilities that have a severe effect on the organizational network. So if there's something that, for instance, has not been made public very widely, maybe it's novel, we want to make sure that as a vulnerability analyst, that person can find that vulnerability. And lastly, perform vulnerability assessments and penetration testing. This means that the vulnerability management analyst will need to have penetration testing skills. So at the level of a certified ethical hacker or an ECSA level individual that can actually run penetration tests against any device or network required. Next, we look at the system data architect. And the architect is going to design processes. So they're in the design business. They're going to design the automation for your threat intelligence, for your data support, for your incident response, for vulnerability management, for security operations, for intelligence. So they're going to design the automation and the processes for all of that. So the architect needs to have a very strong capability to manage and maintain all the systems that you work with in your organization. And then on top of that, they need to have the same skills as a pen tester, ethical hacker level person to be able to apply that knowledge in designing processes. They're going to collaborate with external vendors to nurture an effective data integration process. So as you have tools from many disparate vendors, we want to put those together and make sure that the security that your organization has designed applies to all of it. Next, the system data architect will regularly update all the tools they're using, generate data from security structures like STIX, TAXII, TAXII, or Cyberox, or whichever you're working with, and then coordinate with other teams to create security technology correlation rules. So this is what your system data architect does, and that gives us some of the roles and responsibilities that we have when we're hiring for our TI job roles. Next, we look at identifying core competencies and skills. And I mentioned a little bit of this as we were in the job roles, but we need to understand that there are going to be core competencies and skills that analysts should possess before building these teams. Number one, leadership. You can have somebody who's extremely brilliant, very good at their job, one of the best in the world, but yet has no leadership capability. We need to make sure that the person who is working to build the CTI teams has leadership capability to guide fellow employees, educate management, act on potential threats in a timely manner. And in some cases, in order to get more leadership, you'll need to have less technical capability. So this is almost like a management or supervisory position, somebody who could interface with all of those roles, but yet still be able to present the technical side of things too. So we have a pretty didactic capability here. Number two is analytical and critical thinking skills. Because this person is going to be writing reports, they're going to be coordinating data, they're going to be working with employees and managers, etc. Another one that, to me, that's very important is curiosity. Curious about how to discover and interpret information about threat actors. If you have an employee that has great skills and great leadership, great technical skills, but really couldn't care at all about what's going on in the IT security, cybersecurity realm. They don't care. It doesn't give them any type of thrill to find out what's going on. Right? We want somebody who's actually drawn to it, who's curious. Somebody who, when left to themselves, would do it anyway. They're curious about what's going on. And along with that, willing to learn how cyber criminals and hackers build and execute attack campaigns, as well as the TTPs used to perform the attack. So curiosity and a willingness to learn, a certain brain plasticity. You know, we want them to be able to be always on the lookout for new things and wanting to find that information and integrate it. Next, we look at persistence and drive. And that used to sometimes be called stick-to-itiveness. You want to stick to the task once you get it, maintaining that productivity graph without frequent lapse. So yes, they're curious, they're willing to learn, they have good technical skills, great leadership skills, but can they sustain that over time? We want to make sure that there isn't a burst of really good productivity, and then after that, nothing happens. So persistence and drive. And of course, we cannot ever de-emphasize technical expertise in the field of cybersecurity. So this is somebody who's a great programmer, great with computer networks, big data analytics, and that understands the sweep of IT systems overall. Somebody who can actually describe to you how a device in one part of the network communicates with a device on the other side of the network. I find that there are many skilled professionals who cannot explain that cogently. Someone who can actually explain to you how a specific device works within the network at the data level, at the network level, at any level in the OSI or in the IP model, whatever it is. They need to be able to understand that for all the devices on the network. One of the things that we find with cybersecurity is it engulfs so many fields. So if you have an IT professional that is extremely good with Windows servers and they're great with PowerShell automation, but yet they don't understand Linux, that's going to be a handicap in cybersecurity. Or if you have an IT professional that's great with Windows servers and Linux administration, but doesn't understand routing and switching, that is going to be a handicap. Or if you have an IT worker that understands routing and switching and understands servers and the services on those Windows and Linux, but knows nothing about programming or scripting, then that will be a handicap. We're actually looking for someone whose skills will go the gamut. And after scripting and programming, then we look at big data and we look at large collections of networked computers and how those interact with each other. And eventually, you're going to need to make sure that your skill set includes artificial intelligence and quantum computation. Those are two areas that are going to play a significant role over the next decade. So if your IT staff doesn't have those skills, then you'll need to either educate them, send some people out for master's degrees, send some people out for certifications, or think about bringing in new staff. So the technical expertise is one of the most important parts here. Cannot ever de-emphasize that. Next is a self-initiator. Right? We want someone who will get up out of the chair and get the work done without being told. Team-oriented, strong organizational skills. So with a self-initiator, there are some people that are brilliant. They're great leaders. They are fairly curious and willing to learn, but they just don't get anything done until there's a crisis, and then maybe they do a good job. We want somebody who will do a good job and self-initiate at all points in their career. Strong communication skills. This person needs to be able to write, to communicate, to blog, to post on websites and in many different spheres. So without strong communication skills, this person will not be able to take all this knowledge and disseminate it to others. And also, this person should be personable. It doesn't list it as one of these things, but you could have great leadership, great analysis, curiosity, willingness to learn, persistence, drive, technical expertise, self-initiation, strong communication, but whenever anybody works with this person, the person walks away saying, oh, I really don't want to be in that guy's office again. Or I really don't want to be in a meeting with that guy anymore because they have an effusive or abrasive personality. So we also, when hiring, need to make sure that this team member will work well within the team. So we have to sacrifice a little bit of one for the other sometimes, but either way, keep all of these skills, core competencies, in mind. Next, we look at defining talent acquisition. So we have a strategy that we're going to need to use to acquire the talent that we need for our teams. And so the first thing we need to do is understand threat intelligence and put it into practice. And this requires making sure that we have the right talent. We want to hire people with the right stuff that we talked about on that previous slide. So we look at our core competencies, and when you look at that slide of core competencies, think about your organization and who it is that you are already putting together in your mind to be on that team, or who you currently have on your team. Who do you actually need on your team? What talent might you need to acquire for your TI team? So you need to have a strategy. And this strategy is not just going to be used once, but it's going to be used throughout your organization's TI activities, because over time, you're going to lose personnel and have to hire more personnel. Or you're going to expand and have to hire more personnel. So, number one, leverage your threat collaboration environment. You're going to initiate that recruitment looking for an individual within the organization rather than depending on third-party vendors. This is actually very important. And why is this important? There are very likely, especially for those of you in management, there are very likely people in the organization that have been waiting for an opportunity to move up or to move laterally in the organization. And many of them are not very vocal about it, and they do their job on a day-to-day basis, and it's not immediately obvious that they are good candidates for that position. In the past, I've seen that some organizations will not think about those people that they have within the organization and immediately go to the outside. And what that does is demoralize the troops inside the organization. Now, if you laid out very clearly your requirements for the job position and looked internally first, and if people did apply for it, showed them where they need to be to have this job during the interview process, didn't hire anyone internally, and went externally, then at least the people internally will know that they were at least given a shot. And that makes a big difference in an organization. So be careful to initiate your recruitment internally. Next, we look at recruiting the right talent. So if the current employees don't fit that profile that we're looking for, then we go outside of the organization and we hire from the outside. Another area that you can do, even if you have to go outside, is if you have employees that have expressed interest in that position and they have a lot of the indicators that we were looking at, but not enough of them, perhaps they would be willing to be educated up to that level, and then later on in the process they can go back through and be added into that team. So that's something to look at also. Next, we look at outsourcing the process to a managed security service provider. So an MSSP, what they do, they live for jobs like this, for gigs like this. This is what they do. They take the same processes we've been talking about this entire course, and they plug it in a turnkey manner into your organization or into whatever organization that they are working with. So if you really can't create the required positions, hiring a managed security service provider, MSSP, is great to help cover your lack of resources. One thing to think about when hiring outside to an MSSP, is this a permanent move for your organization? Or is this an interim move for your organization? So in some organizations, you may realize we're too small to have the team that we need inside the organization. And so if I hire the number of people, the amount of output money that I'm going to be spending for these people is 50% greater than paying for an external MSSP team. If that is the case, you're going to need to monitor that equation, because over time that MSSP is going to charge you more money, and you're going to need to reevaluate perhaps on an annualized basis if it's still worth it. And if it isn't, then you'll need to have a very strong plan to spin out the MSSP and cut over to an internal team. So either way, you need to determine if it's permanent or not. Next, we look at building and positioning an intelligence team. So the first point we look at is that building an efficient cyber threat intelligence team is important to effectively leverage threat intelligence based on the maturity of the organization. And I think the major phrase here that's important is based upon the maturity of the organization. And so you may have a threat intelligence team that is brought on board to an organization that is just in startup mode. And so all the other parts of the organization are not yet fully to where they need to be. And so your team may need to make adjustments as they go. On the other hand, you may have a threat intelligence team that's integrated into a mature organization with mature processes, and that's going to be a completely different way of settling in as a team within that organization. So you're going to have to evaluate that. Next, we see that there are several factors that have to be considered while building an intelligence team, like who must be included in the team and where the team should be placed within the organization. And sometimes I've seen teams like this placed in a very odd position in the organization because the management of that team was in a non-technical part of the organization. And that is a mistake in the long run. So if there is not current structure for your TI team to fit into the organization, you need to create the structure. So for instance, if you don't have current cybersecurity management structures in place now, then you're going to need to put those cybersecurity management structures in place and then move your team underneath that structure. So rather than your team being an adjunct to marketing or accounting, I've seen stuff like that, you want to make sure that it's right there in the IT cybersecurity line. Next, we see that forming a CTI team can be initiated by selecting the right team members with the right skills. And obviously that's not going to initiate the actual project, but that's what's really going to kick things off, is having the right people like we've been talking about. Threat intelligence team members include technical operations analyst, technical manager, threat analyst, intelligence operator, intelligence manager, and all the other roles that we talked about before. So we have a wide range of team members. And also keep in mind that let what we talk about here inspire your imagination, because there may need to be roles in your team that are not even listed here. So think about it before you put together your team. Also, understanding the threat intelligence requirements is going to help place a team in the correct position. So your organization should already have put together the requirements of this team before going out and selecting members for the team. You don't want to count the chickens before they hatch. And lastly, we see that the threat intelligence team must be placed in a central location for all activities related to adversaries and intrusions. So placement of that team is very important. We talked about that just a little while ago. And now we look at how to prepare an effective threat intelligence team. So we have a team. We want to get them ready to take on the job roles that they've been assigned. So prepare an effective threat intelligence team for analyzing potential threats and protecting the organization from evolving risks and threats. How do we do that? Well, number one, we develop an intelligence priorities framework. So we meet as a team and discuss what are intelligence priorities that we need to look at. And we put together a framework, and then that'll guide us into the different areas that we want to look. The different forums with which we want to associate, the different annual and semi-annual events in which we want to participate, etc. So that framework's going to guide us based upon the priorities that we put together in that framework. Number two, including and fusing intelligence sources. So I'm going to be using sources from so many different locations. I'm going to need to fuse that information and include it so that I can make it actionable and reportable, right? I'm going to create reports for upper management, etc. Number three, mapping intelligence collection. So we don't want to just kind of randomly find sources and collect them. So within our organization and without, as we collect intelligence, we want to have a map as to where and why we got this data. Number four, including specialized threat intelligence experts. And so we're going to go into our field, which is threat intelligence, find experts that are working in the same areas that we're researching, and bring their expertise in through the articles that they write, or maybe even interviewing them in particular individually for information on threats. Number five, distributing intelligence to the audience. We want to make sure that as we have intelligence collected, that it gets distributed to the right people. Next, we're going to look at an overview of threat intelligence sharing. We're going to talk about establishing threat intelligence sharing capabilities, some considerations for sharing threat intelligence, sharing intelligence with a variety of organizations, types of sharing partners too. Who are we going to be sharing this with? And the importance of selection criteria for partners and sharing intelligence securely. Those are the areas that we're going to discover in this section. Let's start with establishing threat intelligence sharing capabilities. First bullet point. Sharing threat intelligence is an important step that provides access to threat information that might be otherwise unavailable to an organization. Here's what happens. Organizations do their own internal research. So let's take a novel virus, for instance. So there's a virus that's been discovered by your team. It's not been widely reported anywhere. You analyze the virus. You come up with some reasons for the virus. For instance, perhaps it was created specifically for spear phishing. If this virus is in the wild, it's possible that it's being a zero-day nuisance to other organizations out there. So you will collaborate in forums and in other means to share the information from your research about this virus. And then you will take information from other resources, because perhaps now that you've put that information out there and they run the same types of tests and algorithms, they're able to say, hey, I found this virus on my system too, and this is what was going on. And yes, it is a spear phishing campaign. And eventually, as a community, you can begin to find the actual threat actors and the campaigns that are being launched against the organization. So sharing threat intelligence is important laterally to your colleagues in the field, and then vertically to your colleagues and management structure at the office. So by sharing threat information, your organization can prevent various security breaches, thwart emerging threats from damaging the network. So let's take another example. In a specific forum that you've worked with for a while and looks like there's pretty intelligent people there, you get somebody who reports that a possible threat has emerged. And this is a worm, and this worm uses the following ports, attacks the following protocols, is introduced in the following vectors, etc. And you look at that and you take the information from there and you examine your organization and you find that there is a campaign right now to introduce that worm into your organization, maybe through some type of chat or text or email, and you can stop it before it even gets to your organization, right? So yes, by sharing threat information, organizations can prevent security breaches, thwart emerging threats. Isn't it nice to be able to stop a problem before it starts? So let's look at planning and preparation activities for sharing threat intelligence. So what do we need to do to plan? Number one, define the goals and objectives for information sharing. Here's an important area. When we share information about threats, we want to make sure that we never share company private information. So for instance, if we share information about a spear phishing campaign, we don't want to say, yeah, they sent emails to our chief executive, Sally, first name, last name, and give out details about what happened and who it is and the structure of the organization. We want to be very careful with that. Right? So the goal and objective is to share the raw information and also to obtain good information from other sources. So make sure your organization knows what your roles and what your goals and what your objectives are. Number two, identify internal sources of threat information. So the internal sources are going to be from your organization's infrastructure and from the people involved with monitoring that infrastructure. Number three, define a scope of information about sharing activities. So who's going to be shared with? What is going to be shared? And how are we going to share this information internally? And one of the biggest areas of sharing, before even considering sharing it to the wider community, is within business groups of your organization. So you may have an organization that's a multinational organization with dozens of business groups spread all over the planet, in that case, you're going to need to make sure and share with those business groups with people of similar roles and capabilities in different business groups. So define the scope of those information sharing activities and establish rules for information sharing. We talked about the TMI, right? Too much information, especially when sharing outside of your organization. But there are rules also for information sharing within the organization. For instance, you may have a rule on the speed of sharing. So for instance, I might have discovered what looks like a novel piece of malware, but I haven't figured out what it is yet. And I'm still studying it, and I've had it in my lab for the last week and a half. And meanwhile, a different business unit gets attacked and vanquished by this piece of malware. And I say, oh yeah, I've had that in my desk for a week and a half. Well, why didn't I say anything? Well, because I'm not ready yet. I don't have all my information together. Sometimes getting the minimal information out first is extremely important. So, for instance, new piece of malware comes in. I send out a report immediately saying, it looks like I have a novel piece of malware. I cannot describe where it comes from or what its purpose is, but here are some of the characteristics. Be on the lookout for it. We don't know what it is. And so we actually may not ever know what it is, but having a little bit of information in terms of ports and protocols, etc., might help thwart that malware before it ever gets a foothold. So join a sharing community. So again, that goes into sharing outside of the organization. Make sure that it's a reputable community and that it has it's spoken well of by other communities. So make sure you research the sharing community. And number 6, plan to provide ongoing support to information sharing activities. And so when you have people who are dedicated to finding this information, make sure you support that. I've been in situations where doing this type of research was something very important for my job, but yet it was only a small part of my job. So when I sat down to do research, to read, to compare, other employees say, hey, what he's just doing there, sitting there reading online all day. Can't we give him something else to do? And people will walk up to my desk and try to give me other things to do. You need to support that activity because it takes a lot of work in many cases to find information that's valuable for your organization. Now let's look at considerations for sharing that threat intelligence. We're going to look at data handling classification, at information security. We're going to look at intelligence coverage. We're going to look at format and automation. So with data handling classification, we need to know how to classify data so that we understand and know how it can be distributed among individuals, communities, organizations. If you're working in a government organization, it's easy. There are classification levels that are built in, right? So if you work in DoD, you have starting with secret and then top secret and then SCI. If you are working in DOE, you have Q and other types of clearances for classifications of data. However, most of us don't work in a DOE or DOD or any other type of government or military environment, so we have to develop our own classifications. So for instance, a very simple classification is company private. So if there is really no way to separate out company information from the information that we have regarding a certain type of evolving intrusion, right? We can't decouple the fact that we're vulnerable. We can't decouple the fact that it attacked a specific department. There's just too much information involved with this intrusion to share it with a forum. So it might have to be classified company private. It cannot leave this organization. However, there may be another type of incursion that you've discovered that is very easy to separate from the internals of your organization, and that's something that can be shared. And so you'll need to make sure and have appropriate classifications for information in your organization. Now, one of the cool things is organizations like Microsoft and others who help create data sharing infrastructures have ways to facilitate the classification process that you put into being. So for instance, what I can do is in the workflow of document distribution, I can put a check in a box and say this is classified company private. When I do that, nobody will be able to attach it as an email and send it. Nobody will be able to copy it out of a specific folder, for instance. You can decide what needs to happen with the information. And so you may have those capabilities already built in to some of your networking, and that's something worth looking into. The commonly used classification method is TLP, or Traffic Light Protocol. And this is the one that I'm talking about that different organizations already have built into the communication systems. With TLP, it can help with your classification. Information security. So we need to consider several factors about the security of threat information, like confidentiality, integrity, availability, accountability, authenticity, non-repudiation, and privacy. Now, these terms are all loaded terms. Let's start with one of them, for instance. Confidentiality. Whenever you see the term confidentiality in terms of cybersecurity, it usually means encryption. Why? Because we want to keep that information confidential. So we use everything from IPsec to VPN tunnels to other types of encryption for that data. So we want to make sure that it's encrypted to those for whom we want to hide that information and keep it confidential, and decryptable to those who we want to have access to the information. So that's confidentiality. And integrity, that's where we want to make sure that the data that's initiated in a sending process is exactly the same as it was sent in the receiving process. So it does not get changed in the process of being sent. And so each one of these areas, and if you've been in IT or in security for a while, you should be well familiar with each of these terms. We want to consider these factors for the security of our threat information. Next, we look at intelligence coverage. The intelligence coverage of a sharing platform is reliant on the contribution from its affiliates. So if you have a wide variety of affiliates, then obviously you're going to have a lot more coverage for your sharing platform. Usually, smaller organizations readily share relevant and more comprehensive information as they want to make a stronger trust relationship. So yeah, you'll usually find most of the sharing done by small to medium organizations, and you just want to make sure that there's a wide range of contributions so that you get the best view. Next, we look at format for sharing threat intelligence. To exchange intelligence effectively, proper considerations must be given to the format used. So there are many different open exchange formats like OpenIOC, IODEF, IODEF SCI, Veris, etc. Right? We have so many different ways of exchanging data. And all these are very nice because they plug in usually to the TI systems that we employ, and so they make it very easy to integrate this data into our systems. So we have to decide how we're going to format data that we share. And lastly and importantly, we have automation. We want to automate the sharing of intelligence. It has to be allowed by the Exchange platform. And once you share that intelligence, you want to make sure that as you're doing so, and as you are reviewing received shared intelligence, that there is always a security barrier and security review for all of the intelligence that is shared. Now we look at sharing intelligence with a variety of organizations. We want to understand the importance of sharing that information. Well, why would we do that? Because it can prove valuable when we're looking at adversaries and their attacks to be able to understand what's happening in this area. So the wider a field that we have, the more data and the various types of data that we can get from these organizations. Several threat intelligence vendors have started to accumulate data from various open and proprietary intelligence sources. And then what we can do is we can work with these organizations and take part in some of their widespread data collection and make use of it in our organization. And so we have growth of organizations that are willing to share information with people in their industry, with other organizations. And so we need to decide to which organizations that we will share our data. So threat intelligence information sharing organizations are, for instance, if you have information sharing analytics centers, or commercial vendors, or trading partners, or informal contacts even. So there are a variety of ways to go with sharing data with organizations. Let's look at some types of sharing partners out there that we would be able to share information with. So let's look at some types of sharing partners that we would engage. The threat intelligence landscape is vast. Huge numbers of organizations engage with many different partners to help with collection of threat information. So first we look at providers of threat indicators. And what these do is provide signatures. Signatures for what? Well, signatures for screening rules for firewall, signatures for anti-malware software, signatures for IDS, IPS, signatures for UTM systems, Unified Threat Management, and signatures for other types of products. And so we can say, hey, I've found threat indicator signatures for my specific network devices, and use those signatures. And if we create specific signatures for our devices, we can share those with other partners. Next, we look at providers of threat data feeds. And they provide data feeds that include collections of validated and prioritized threat indicators, along with detailed technical analysis of malware samples, botnets, DOS attacks, DDoS attacks, and methods and various malicious tools. So we have an ongoing stream of validated and prioritized indicators. We can take these and apply them to our systems and our procedures so that we can avoid those specific types of malware and botnets, etc. So those are providers of threat data feeds. So providers of threat indicators, providers of threat data feeds, and next we look at providers of comprehensive cyber intelligence. And there are only a few organizations that provide all three types of intelligence: threat indicators, data feeds, and strategic threat intelligence. And so these big players, in many cases, are going to cost money to associate with. And if that's the case, then you need to work that into budget and make sure that you get the most out of sharing with comprehensive cyber threat intelligence organizations. So are you going to choose a threat intelligence information sharing partner? What are some criteria to look at? You're going to need to develop your own selection criteria, but here are some that you can start with when looking for a threat intelligence information sharing partner. Number one, global and cultural reach. So how far and wide does this potential partner reach? Number two, historical data knowledge. Is this information only germane to this year, or the last 5 years, or the last 10 years? Number three, the range of intelligence deliverables. Are they able to give you intelligence on all of the areas that your organization is looking for? APIs and integrations. If you have an appropriate application programming interface, you'll be able to integrate it with your organization's tools. Number five, intelligence platform, knowledge base, and portal. Are you going to be able to do a nice search? Can that search be done with wildcards? Is there a portal that you can install locally? Is it a web portal? So look for that type of information to be able to get that intelligence and search for it. Number five, client services. What services do they offer? And how does that work with your organization's goals? And number seven, access to experts. Sometimes you just need to talk to somebody. So you've gone through the intelligence base, you've looked at the intelligence platform in their portal, you've done all the work you can, but does this partner with whom you are working have somebody that you can chat with online or call who is an expert in that area? So access to experts is always very important. Now let's talk about sharing intelligence security. So we are going to share intelligence. How do we be secure? there are 4 things to look at with sharing intelligence security. Number 1 is authentication. Number 2 is authorization. Number 3 is data protection. And lastly, we have logging activity. So with authentication, we want to know who is authorized to access the system, who is able to either upload or download shared data with our system. How will the entitlements be managed? So as we move information, we share data, who and how is that being managed? Which group is responsible for it, and who is monitoring it? Will the existing identity and access management, or IAM, suffice to provide authentication? And I should hope so. And if it isn't, this means that you'll have to have an extension to your IAM, or you'll have to have a completely different authentication process, which can prove problematic with password updates, changes, and so on. So the better that it can integrate with your IAM, the better. So next we look at, is the manufacturer authentication required or not? And we need to require as much authentication as is possibly convenient. How to authenticate machine-to-machine sharing using standard protocols and APIs. Again, we mentioned APIs and protocols. We want to make sure that our machines can talk to each other. And then last, for authentication, what is the procedure to deprovision a business partner? For authorization, we see what types of data and threat intelligence sources are accessed by each partner. So we need to make sure that each partner can segregate the data such that if you don't want that data to be accessed, then with your authentication and authorization systems, they will not either see that data or have access to it. How will the entitlements that include new business partners and authorizations, how will those changes be made? So as you grow, expand, add new business partners, remove business partners, are you going to be able to maintain your authentication and authorization systems? Data protection. How is the threat intelligence data anonymized and or secured? We want to strip any PII out of the threat intelligence data. Is it necessary to use data encryption to prevent unauthorized access? So if we're sharing data with a partner that we don't want others to intercept, read, and use, then we definitely want to make sure that it's encrypted and deny access to anybody who we do not want having access to that information. And then lastly, we have logging. We want to log all of the access, all of the activities, all of the data shared, when it was shared, at what time it was shared, what date it was shared, on both systems, going both ways when we're sharing data. Well, it's great. Your program is up and running. Your project has succeeded, right within budget, almost on time, and now your threat intelligence program is up and running. Now it's time to review it. And this review is going to need to be conducted not only on an immediate basis, but on an ongoing basis to make sure that your threat intelligence program is meeting the goals for which it was initially set up. So we're going to look at reviewing the threat intelligence program. We're going to look at threat intelligence-led engagement and reviewing that, considerations for your review, and then assessing the success and failure of your threat intelligence program. One of the most important parts of the review of your threat intelligence program is to be honest. We want honest, good information so that we can decide where we go from here. You might find that your threat intelligence program is running just like you thought, meeting all of the criteria that you set out in the very beginning, or you may find that your threat intelligence program is doing something else. Whatever it is, it needs to be measured and honestly reported to the stakeholders. So let's look at an intelligence-led engagement review. One of the threat intelligence products is disseminated and used by your business, technology, customers. It's time to conduct a review on the success or failure of the program. Evaluate all overall end user satisfaction. How's it going out there with your new product? The important question to be answered is whether the delivered intelligence is providing sufficient understanding. For what purpose? For mitigating various threats. So what we want to do is see if it is working. We may have a program that's working, everybody's busy, everybody's making reports, we're feeding that information back into our information systems and our cybersecurity systems. It's integrated well with multiple APIs and multiple levels. People are working hard, but is it actually mitigating the threats? That's what we want to know. So reviewing the threat intelligence program helps the organization to determine the program's success and further work towards continuous improvement. This is an area that's extremely important. Continuous improvement. That means that we review, we find out where we are, find areas that need improvement, we create a method for getting that improvement. We don't just state that it needs improvement, we create a method for getting there. Then we wrap back around and do it again and continually improve. So we want to make sure that we're continuously improving our TI program. And the TI program review itself is going to help us to answer the following questions. Number one, did the program completely solve the issues that it was intended to address? If it did not, then we need to know why not. So did it do that? Is there any scope of improving further and delivering even bigger benefits? Is there any possibility for doing that? So perhaps the TI program not only met its objectives, but the benefits that it has brought into your organization are huge. Well, we need to capture that information. What are the various lessons learned that could be applied to future TI programs? So perhaps we've learned a lot about the implementation of the program, the budget of the program, the resources of the program, and now we know that if we ever have to launch this in another business unit or we need to duplicate it somewhere else, we know what to avoid or what to encourage. So what lessons have we learned? This is very good to follow up a while after the program has begun. Some considerations for reviewing your threat intelligence program. Like I was mentioning before, it needs to be honest. So openness, be open and honest about the review that you are conducting. And one of the areas where what I like to do in my line of work, whether it be consulting or whether it be working on any type of IT or cybersecurity with customers, is to work myself out of a job. In other words, do your job so well and automate it so well that you are not as needed as much, which means that you can work on other jobs. And if you're open and honest about how your systems have been implemented, how the TI program has fared from its incipience all the way to now, then perhaps you can discover efficiencies in the program that are saving your organization lots of money and time. You have worked yourself out of a job. Your organization is actually so efficient, it is making itself a net gain for your organization. Objectiveness. While reviewing the project, all the details about what happened during the project should be in objective terms. And so during the review, you want to make sure that the principals who are conducting the review don't have anything emotionally invested in this review so that they can be objective. Also, you want to document success. Document all of the practices and processes that led to the success of the threat intelligence program. We want to make sure that management and all the stakeholders know what it is and maybe even who it is that made this program a success. We want to blow the horn, toot the horn of the program, make it so that we know that others understand how well this program is doing. Look with hindsight, so concentrate on the unknown facts that are known now that led to the increase in implementation risks. So we look back and we say, this is what led us to start the investigation of putting together this program. Now if we see where we are now, we've come a long way. What have we done? Let's write down all the facts about what this TI program has accomplished. Focus on the future. The main objective of reviewing is to learn from the mistakes and avoid making similar mistakes in future projects. And what you indicate in the focus on the future is really going to help others who come along next to avoid some of the same pitfalls. Focus on both positives and negatives. Now, it's possible that it was a negative experience for people who were involved in the project. I've seen projects like that, where you have a project that turned out really well, but it was very tough for the implementers. Why was it that way? Or perhaps the project implementation was very positive overall, and all your teams worked together very well. Why did that happen? And if you know why it was positive and why it was negative, you know what the positives were and what the negatives were, well, then you can increase the positives in your next implementation or deployment. So learn each of those and be able to communicate both of those. I've worked with team members that really can only communicate the negative. They don't know how to communicate the positive. So make sure you can do both. Next, we look at assessing the success and failure of the threat intelligence program. So we want to measure the success of your TI program and learn from failure. And doing this will create a great impact on the various business practices in the organization. So we take the successes. So for instance, we can look at the incidences of intrusions, of malware that have actually caused problems on our systems. We look at the data from before the program to after the program. And if we see a huge decrease, then that will be a success. If we see the same number or more, then perhaps we're looking at a failure. Why is it that maybe in one section of the organization or in one part of the implementation, we've had failures? That needs to be examined, and we need to make sure we track it so that we can learn from that information. Assess the true effectiveness of the project. If we do that, it's going to provide a learning opportunity for team members for future projects. So we want to make sure that we actually, instead of inflating numbers or try to make ourselves look good, find out what the true effectiveness was. To assess the threat intelligence program, it includes the following activities that we need to review. Number one, a gap analysis. So how far have we come? The gap analysis says we were here, now we're over there. So how far was that? What did we produce? What savings did we produce? What future savings? Like for instance, if we find that with the new program, we used to discover 5 to 10 potential long-term threats a year, and now we're discovering 500 long-term threats in a year. Can that perhaps mean that in the future that we are going to save the company quite a lot? We need to elucidate that. So the gap analysis shows us from where we started to where we are, what needs to be done in the future, etc. Number two, determine whether the TI program goals were accomplished. And these should have been set out very clearly in the beginning, so it should be fairly easy to determine if the goals were accomplished. And then determine the fulfillment of stakeholders. And some of this is going to be done using surveys, where we will set up a survey and send it to stakeholders so that they can honestly report their satisfaction with the way the program was implemented. Right? We want to have static and well-defined facts. Determine the costs and benefits associated with the program. And so for this, we'll need to do a cost-benefit analysis and find out, all right, so the total cost of the program, here was our budget, here was the total cost. There might be a delta in between the budget and the total cost. And then we want to find out what were the benefits that we obtained from the program and see if they were worth the cost. Was it worth it? We'll find that out with a CBA, cost-benefit analysis. Identify areas of further improvement. And it is the case that sometimes a project is implemented it's up and running, but there may be a couple of low-level parts of the project that never got implemented. That's possible. So that's one area for improvement, so we can finish the last details of the project. Other times we find that we've implemented part of the project fully, but it is not giving us the same return on investment as other parts of the project. Right? We can improve there. Perhaps we're having inefficiencies in parts of the project. We can improve there. And then we look at lessons learned. So what do we learn about the implementation of the TI project? And we take those lessons learned and we want to make sure and document them. What we don't want is just a meeting where people sit around and talk about this information. We want it all documented so that it can be beneficial to anybody in the future. Lastly, report findings and recommendations. And what I would do with findings and recommendations is not only report it, but have a findings and recommendations meeting. Because the project is already implemented. So it's less likely that upper management will read your report. So what you do is you involve them in a meeting with the report, go through the report, and make sure that they understand all of your findings and recommendations. And then you can call the project ended and successful. So in this module, we have discussed identifying the current threat landscape and the business risk to the organization. We've talked about performing requirement analysis, including prioritizations of requirements. We've also got insight into establishing a threat intelligence program, and we looked at how to put together a team and to share the threat intelligence. And in the next module, we're going to look at various topics related to data collection and processing.